The summer of 1878 arrived in Colorado the way most bad things did, quietly, without warning, and with the kind of heat that made people do things they'd spend the rest of their lives regretting. Red Hollow wasn't much of a town. It sat in a shallow valley between two ridgelines, like something the mountains had coughed up and forgotten about. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a courthouse when the occasion demanded, and maybe 60 structures total if you counted the outhouses generously. The kind of place where everybody knew what you'd had for breakfast and what you'd argued about with your wife the night before, and where news traveled faster than horses because people had nothing better to do than talk. Elira Boone had grown up 6 miles east of town on a cattle ranch that had seen better decades. She knew Red Hollow the way you know a place you've never quite belonged to. Its rhythms, its moods, its particular brand of smallness. She knew which merchant watered down his whiskey. She knew which family's dogs bit strangers. She knew the way the dust smelled before a thunderstorm and the way it smelled after. And she knew, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent 18 years watching adults make bad decisions, that her father was a man who loved her and couldn't stop destroying everything he touched. Franklin Boone had many qualities. He was generous to a fault, funny in the way that men who've known real hardship sometimes are, darkly, with a kind of sideways wit that made you laugh before you realized what he was really saying. He could rope a steer faster than anyone in the county, and he could fix a wagon axle by feel alone in the dark. He was the kind of father who taught his daughter to shoot, to ride, to read the weather in the color of the sky, to never apologize for taking up space in a room. He was also a gambling man, and that particular quality had, over the course of several years and one catastrophic winter, eaten everything else alive. Elira found out about the debt the way she found out about most of her father's disasters. Too late, by accident, and in the worst possible way. She'd come into the kitchen before dawn on a Wednesday, intending to start the stove and get water boiling before the morning chores. Her father was already at the table. That alone was unusual. Franklin Boone slept like a stone and rose reluctantly, cursing mornings as a matter of principle. But there he sat in the gray pre-light, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, staring at the table like it had said something unforgivable to him. "Papa," she'd said, "you're up early." He didn't answer right away. That was when she noticed his hands were shaking. "Sit down, Elira. I've got to start the—" "Sit down." She sat. He told her. He told her about the card games in Silas Crow's back room over the winter, the kind of games where the stakes kept climbing because Crow had a way of making a man feel like the next hand was the one that would fix everything. He told her about the notes he'd signed, the amounts, the interest that had compounded over months into a number that made her stomach drop. He told her about the conversation he'd had 3 days ago in Red Hollow, in the back of the saloon, with Silas Crow himself. He told her what Crow had offered instead of repayment. Elira sat very still through all of it. She had her mother's habit of going quiet when she was angry. Her mother had been a woman who could level a man with 7 words and a level stare, and Elira had inherited that capacity fully. She sat across from her father in the gray kitchen light, and she listened to him explain how he'd agreed in principle to a marriage arrangement, and she waited until he'd finished before she said anything at all. "You agreed," she said. "Not a question. It clears the debt, all of it. And Crow's offering to let me stay on the land, work it, keep—" "You agreed." Franklin Boone looked at his daughter. His eyes were red, and there was something broken in his face that she'd never seen there before, not even when her mother died. And some part of her recognized that this was a man who knew exactly what he'd done and couldn't undo it. "He's powerful, Elira. He owns half the county. If I can't pay, he'll take the land, take everything." "He can take it," she said. Her voice was very flat. "He can take every stick and stone of it. I don't care. You don't understand what men like that do when—" "I understand what men like that are." She stood up. "And I understand what you just told him he could have." She left the kitchen. She heard her father say her name twice, but she didn't stop, because if she stopped, she was going to say something that couldn't be unsaid. And some part of her was still trying to hold on to the version of him she'd needed him to be. That had been 4 days ago. There were men in the West who wore their power quietly, like a coat they'd had so long they forgot they were wearing it. Silas Crow was not one of those men. He was 51 years old, built like something that had been meant to be larger and had been compressed by circumstance into a hard, dense shape. Not fat. He'd never been fat. but solid in a way that suggested an interior architecture of pure will and appetite. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and he kept it slicked back with something that smelled of cedar. He dressed well for Red Hollow, in dark suits that would have been appropriate in Denver, and he had the habit of wearing a pocket watch he checked constantly, as if time were something he was personally supervising. He owned the Crow Mining Concern, which had operations in 3 different mountain ranges and employed directly or indirectly a significant portion of the county. He owned debts from half the ranchers in the valley. He'd been married twice. His first wife had died of fever. That's what people said. And his second had left in the night and never come back. And people said different things about what had caused that, and none of the things they said were comfortable. He was not cruel in an obvious way. He didn't shout or strike. He was the kind of man whose cruelty wore the face of reasonableness, of practicality, of what did you expect. When he decided he wanted something, he went about obtaining it with the patient, methodical focus of a man who had learned that most obstacles dissolved if you applied the right pressure in the right places and waited long enough. He'd decided he wanted Elira Boone sometime around February, when he'd first seen her in the general store. He wasn't a man who examined his own desires too carefully. He wanted her, and she was obtainable through her father's debt, and that was the shape of the situation, as far as he was concerned. He sent word on a Thursday morning that the arrangement would be formalized on Saturday. He did not ask if Saturday was convenient. The street was full of dust and people, and the particular uncomfortable energy of a crowd that has gathered to witness something and isn't quite sure how to feel about it. It was 11 in the morning. The sun was already hammering the earth in that relentless July way that made the shadows look hard-edged and the air above the road shimmer slightly. People had come in from the surrounding ranches and farms for the weekly trading. The general store was busy, the livery full, the saloon already earning, and word had gotten around, the way it always did in Red Hollow, that something was happening. Elira had come to town in the wagon with her father. She'd said nothing for the 6-mile ride. Franklin Boone had talked at first, a low, apologetic murmur about circumstances and necessity and what he hoped for her future, and she'd watched the road and said nothing. And eventually he'd fallen silent too, and they'd made the rest of the trip in a quiet that had weight to it. She was wearing her mother's dress. It was blue cotton with small white flowers, and it had been packed away in a cedar chest for 7 years. She'd taken it out that morning and put it on with a kind of deliberate intention she couldn't entirely explain to herself. Not submission, not ceremony, but something more like witness. Her mother had been a woman who chose her own terms. Wearing this dress felt like reaching back for something. She'd braided her hair. Her hair was dark brown, almost black, and thick, and it ran to the middle of her back, and she'd braided it tight in a single plait because loose hair in the wind had always annoyed her practically. She'd worn her boots, the good ones with the worn-down left heel she kept meaning to get fixed. She'd looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin and she'd thought, this is not how this ends. She didn't know yet exactly how she meant that, but she felt it. Crow's man, a barrel-chested fellow named Holt, who worked as a kind of general enforcer and intermediary, met them at the edge of town. He had 2 other men with him, which Elira noted without expression. 3 men to escort one 18-year-old girl and her father to a business transaction. Either Crow was thorough by habit or he'd anticipated resistance. Probably both. "Miss Boone," Holt said, with the approximate shape of courtesy. "Mr. Holt," she said. They walked her toward the saloon, which was serving today as a venue for the formalization of the arrangement, because Crow owned that too. And the crowd on the street shifted and parted and watched. She could feel the watching. She'd grown up in this town and she knew these people, and she could feel the specific texture of their discomfort. They didn't want this, most of them, or at least they weren't comfortable with it, but they were also afraid of Crow's influence and afraid of getting involved in something that wasn't their business. And so they stood on their porches and in their doorways and at the edges of the road, and they watched. The walk from the wagon to the saloon was maybe 200 yards. It felt considerably longer. She walked with her spine straight and her chin level. She would not give this town the satisfaction of seeing her shrink. She would not give Crow the image of a girl being broken. Whatever happened next, she walked toward it as herself. Holt had her arm on the left. One of the other men was on her right. Her father walked behind, which she thought said something about him that she didn't have the emotional space to examine right now. They were perhaps 30 yards from the saloon when someone said, "That's far enough." His name she would learn later. In that moment, he was simply a shape, a man standing in the middle of the road about 20 feet ahead, which was close enough to be impossible to ignore, and far enough to suggest he wasn't in a hurry, which was in itself a kind of statement. He was somewhere in his late 20s, not a large man, not Holt size, but there was something about the way he stood that was very still, very deliberate, that made the space around him feel like it belonged to him. He wore trail clothes, worn and practical, and a flat-brimmed hat with the sweat stains of genuine use. He had a rifle in his right hand, not aimed yet, just held low and easy in the way that men who are comfortable with weapons carry them, which was, paradoxically, the most dangerous way. The street had gone very quiet. Holt stopped. Elira felt his hand tighten on her arm, and then, interestingly, not loosen. "Step out of the road, cowboy," Holt said. The tone was the particular tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed, applied with controlled force. "This ain't your affair." The man in the road looked at him with dark eyes that carried no particular emotion. "I figure it's become mine," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. Slight southwestern accent, Texas or New Mexico, Elira thought, with the part of her brain that was still functioning analytically. "You know who you're talking to? Who you're talking for?" "I know who I'm looking at," the man said. He glanced, just briefly, just for a moment, at Elira. Not with pity, not with the particular hero gazing upon the rescued expression she might have braced against, just with a kind of direct acknowledgement, as if confirming she was there. Then his eyes went back to Holt. "Last time I'll say it. Step aside." "And if we don't?" The man tilted his head very slightly. "Then this morning gets a lot more interesting than you planned for." The two men flanking Elira were moving their hands. She felt it, felt the shift in weight, the telegraph of intention. She had a moment, a very short, very clear moment, where she understood that this could go immediately and badly wrong, and she also understood that standing here doing nothing was not going to produce a better outcome. She'd been raised on a ranch. She'd been bucked off horses, and she'd helped pull calves, and she'd carried fence posts in mud up to her knees, and she'd shot rattlesnakes off the porch rail from 20 yards. She was not, despite her circumstances, a passive person by nature. Holt's grip had shifted when he'd stopped. His attention was on the man in the road. His hand on her arm was still firm, but his focus was elsewhere. She drove her elbow into his ribs, hard, with everything she had. Holt made a sound like a man who has just been hit in the ribs and wasn't expecting it, which is the only sound a man in that situation makes, and his grip broke. What happened in the next few seconds was chaotic in the way that most things involving firearms and surprise people in small spaces are chaotic. The man with the rifle moved, sideways and forward simultaneously, in a way that made him a harder target and a closer threat. And the two flanking men hesitated, because hesitation is what happens when your plan encounters something it didn't account for. Holt was still processing having been elbowed by an 18-year-old girl in her mother's dress. "Don't," the man with the rifle said, and his voice had dropped to something very quiet and very serious that cut through the confusion more effectively than shouting would have. He had the rifle up now, not pointed at anyone specifically, but present in a way that demanded accounting. "Don't reach for it. Nobody needs to die today." The crowd had pressed back. People were very still the way people get still when they're calculating distance and cover. The street was the kind of quiet that has a texture to it. Holt straightened up slowly, one hand on his side, his eyes fixed on the man with the rifle, with an expression that was not fear exactly, but was close neighbors with it. "You understand what you're doing," Holt said. "You understand who you're making an enemy of." "I've had enemies," the man said. "Step back from her." A long moment. Long enough that Elira had time to notice the sweat on the back of Holt's neck and the way one of the flanking men was breathing through his mouth. Holt stepped back. The man looked at Elira. "You got a horse?" She almost wanted to laugh, which was not an appropriate response to the situation, but was perhaps an honest one. "No. Mine's hitched in front of the livery." He didn't move his eyes from Holt and the other men. "You can ride?" "Since I was 4. "Then walk to the livery. Don't run. There's a bay mare. She's patient. Take her." "What are you going to do?" "Stand here," he said simply, "until you're gone." She stood still for approximately 3 seconds, which doesn't sound like a long time, but is, in that kind of moment, considerable. She looked at Holt and the two men. She looked at the man with the rifle. She looked at the crowd on the edge of the street, all those familiar faces full of that complicated blend of sympathy and helplessness and relief that it wasn't them standing in the road. She looked at her father. Franklin Boone was standing at the back of the group where Holt and his men had stopped, and he was watching her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't protest. It was something that might have been a very tired, very complicated kind of love, mixed with what she could only describe as someone acknowledging, finally and fully, that the thing they'd done was wrong. He didn't call out to her. He didn't argue. He just looked at her, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that she couldn't name yet and would spend a long time thinking about later. She turned and walked toward the livery. She didn't run. She'd been told not to, and she also didn't want to. Running was conceding something, and she was done conceding things today. She walked with her spine straight and her chin level, her boots raising small puffs of dust, the crowd parting ahead of her. Someone, a woman whose name she knew, whose children she'd helped with reading lessons the winter before, reached out and briefly touched her arm as she passed. Not gripping, just contact. She didn't stop, but she acknowledged it with a slight tilt of her head. The livery was cool and smelled of horse and hay and the comfortable animal warmth she'd grown up around. A bay mare stood in the first stall outside the door, hitched to a post, strong-looking, with a white blaze and calm eyes, saddled already. Illyra checked the cinch from habit, found it properly tight. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up, and the mare shifted under her weight and then settled. She rode out of the livery and turned back toward the street. The man with the rifle had not moved from his position in the road. Holt and his men had also not moved, though the energy had changed, become watchful rather than threatening, the way things get when an immediate confrontation has been paused but not resolved. Several of Crow's other men had materialized at the edges of the street, drawn by noise and instinct. Half a dozen of them, at least, armed. Illyra rode up beside the man and stopped the mare. He glanced up at her. Something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, but an adjustment of expectation. He'd told her to go and she hadn't gone, and he was recalibrating. "You were supposed to ride out," he said. "I don't take orders from you," she said with perfect pleasantness. "Where's your horse?" A brief pause. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was related to one. "Brown gelding. Other side of the street, in front of Garland's store." "Then let's go get him. Miss, I'm not leaving this street alone while 6 men are between me and the road south, and I don't think you are either." He looked at Holt. He looked at the men positioned around the street. He did the calculation, visible in his face, quick and practical, not panicked. "Stay even with me," he said. "Don't gallop until I say." "All right." They moved across the street, her on the mare, him walking with the rifle still present and prominent. And the crowd watched, and Holt's men watched, and nobody moved, partly because of the rifle, and partly because of what they were looking at. A young woman on horseback, who held herself like she'd decided something permanent, and a man with steady hands who had inserted himself into a situation that had nothing to do with him and seemed entirely at peace with that choice. He untied the brown gelding and mounted in one motion. The horse was as calm as its rider. "Now," he said quietly. They rode south. Not racing, controlled, purposeful. Behind them, Illyra heard shouts, heard Holt's voice rise in anger, heard the general noise of a situation spinning out in directions no one had planned for. She didn't look back. The road south out of Red Hollow ran along the base of the eastern ridge and then curved west toward open grassland. She'd ridden it 100 times. She knew the bend 2 miles out where the ridge dropped away and opened into a broad valley. Knew it the way you know the places that feel like breathing room. They didn't speak for the first mile. The horses moved easily, still contained, still listening to their riders. The town fell behind. The ridge was a wall of dark ponderosa on their left, and the grassland opened on their right, and the sky was that particular deep Colorado blue that looked painted. Finally the man said, "You all right?" "Yes." A pause. "My name is Illyra Boone." "I know," he said. "People talk. What's your name?" "Ronan Vale." She turned the name over briefly. "You're not from Red Hollow?" "No." "Where are you from?" "Originally, New Mexico territory." He looked ahead at the road. I've been at Blackwood Ranch the past 8 months, working. She knew Blackwood Ranch. It was 12 miles northwest of town, owned by the Alderman family, a cattle operation of respectable size and good reputation. Henry Alderman was known as a straight dealer who paid fair wages and didn't ask questions about a man's past. His wife, Clara, was the kind of woman who could simultaneously manage a household, a difficult personality, and an entire afternoon of unexpected guests without losing either composure or hospitality. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Ronan Vale considered the question. Not quickly, not with the easy dismissiveness she might have expected. He actually thought about it. "Because nobody else was going to," he said. She looked at him. He was watching the road, hands easy on the reins, and there was nothing theatrical about him at all. He'd done a dramatic thing with the complete absence of drama, and sitting beside him on the road south, she found that considerably more interesting than a speech would have been. "That's not much of an answer," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." He paused. "I saw you walk down that street, and I thought, someone ought to have the basic decency to say something." He shrugged, a small motion. "So I said something." The road curved ahead, the valley opened up. The air smelled of sage and something cooler coming off the mountains. "Crow won't let this go," she said. "No. He'll come after us." "Yes." "You knew that before you stepped into the road." Ronan glanced at her then. His eyes were dark brown and direct and carried that quality she was starting to recognize as simply being how he looked at everything. Straight on, without flinching, but without aggression either, just looking at what was there. "I did," he said. She faced forward again. The mare moved underneath her in a comfortable 4-beat walk. Somewhere back in Red Hollow, she knew Silas Crow was being told what had happened, and the particular machinery of an angry, powerful man's response was beginning to turn. She thought about her father's face when she'd looked at him, the exhausted, complicated love, the acknowledgement. She thought about her mother's dress, which she was still wearing, blue cotton with small white flowers, probably getting dust on the hem right now from the road. She thought about the woman who'd touched her arm as she passed. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Blackwood Ranch for now," Ronan said. "The Aldermans will take us in. It's not a permanent solution, but it's a safe one while we think." "And after that?" He didn't answer immediately, which she appreciated. She had a deep distrust of people who answered difficult questions without pausing to think. "I don't know yet," he said finally, "but I'd rather figure it out with both of us breathing than have it planned and buried." That was, Alara thought, a reasonable position. They reached Blackwood Ranch in the early afternoon, having cut across open country to avoid the main road and whatever Crow might have sent after them. Ronan knew the terrain in the way working ranch hands know the land they've spent months riding, not from maps, but from presence, from the accumulated knowledge of having moved through it in all kinds of weather and light. He'd ridden quietly for most of the journey, answering her questions when she asked them and not manufacturing conversation when she didn't. She found this restful in a way she hadn't expected. She'd been keyed up for hours, since before dawn, since the kitchen and her father's confession, and the act of simply moving through landscape with a companion who didn't need her to perform anything was a kind of relief she hadn't anticipated. The ranch was a working operation, sprawling and practical, with a main house, several outbuildings, a large barn, and a crew of 7 or 8 hands. It had the functional look of a place where everything was used and nothing was ornamental. The fences were well maintained. The animals were in good condition. These things told her something about the people who ran it. Henry Alderman met them in the yard. He was a broad, weathered man in his mid-50s with a gray beard and the particular permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades in high-altitude sunlight. He looked at Ronan and then at Alara and then at the dust on their horses and the general situation of their arrival, and he put his hands on his hips. "Ronan," he said. "Henry," Ronan said. "I've got a situation." "I can see that." "This is Alara Boone, Franklin Boone's daughter, from the Boone spread east of town." Henry Alderman looked at her with those squinted eyes, and she had the feeling of being assessed with considerable competence. Not unkindly, just thoroughly. "I know the name," he said, "and I've heard some things about the Boone family's recent circumstances." He looked back at Ronan. "And I'd guess what happened this morning is what I'd call an irreversible set of choices." "That'd be accurate," Ronan said. Henry was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. Clara, he called toward the house. Clara Alderman appeared in the doorway, a woman of about 50 with a practical face, gray-streaked hair, and an expression of ready competence. She took in the scene with the speed of someone who'd learned to assess situations quickly. We've got guests, Henry said, for some indeterminate period. Clara looked at Elira and something softened slightly in her practical face. You're hungry, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm all right, Elira said. You haven't eaten since this morning if you've been riding since Red Hollow. Come inside. She held the door open with the manner of someone who doesn't repeat invitations. Both of you. The kitchen was large and clean and smelled of cornbread and coffee, which was, in that moment, one of the better smells Elira had encountered. She sat at the table and Clara put food in front of her without ceremony or excessive sympathy, which Elira appreciated enormously. Excessive sympathy required response. Good food simply required eating. Ronan sat across from her. He'd removed his hat and set it on the chair beside him, and she saw his face more clearly in the indoor light, tired around the eyes, but not troubled. He ate with the focused efficiency of someone who'd learned to eat when food was available because it wasn't always available. Henry came in after seeing to the horses and sat at the head of the table with a cup of coffee he didn't drink so much as hold. Crow's gonna send men, Ronan said. Of course he is, Henry said. He's got legal claim on the debt. Whether he's got legal claim on anything else is another matter, but he'll argue it all together. The sheriff in Red Hollow isn't going to be much help, Henry said. Crow's got him in one pocket or another. He looked at Elira. Your father signed papers? Yes, she said. What did those papers say, do you know? Debt settlement. That's what my father called it. He didn't show me the papers directly. She paused. He may not have read them carefully. Men in debt rarely do, Clara said from the counter, without particular judgment, just the observation of a woman who'd seen it before. Whatever Crow thinks he has in writing, Ronan said, it doesn't matter. She's not property. No paper makes her property. No, Henry said, but it gives him a legal hook to pursue, and with the right judge, which Crow can find, it becomes complicated. He looked at the table for a moment. You can stay here as long as you need. I want to be clear about that. But staying here isn't a long-term answer. Crow's got the reach to make things difficult for this ranch, too, if he decides to. I know, Ronan said. Elira looked at Henry Alderman. I'm not asking you to fight my battles, she said. I don't want to bring this on your family. You didn't bring it, Henry said. It arrived when Crow decided he could arrange a person's future, like a land deed. He had a directness she recognized and respected. But I'm a practical man, and I'll tell you plainly, we can offer you safety now and time to make a plan. We can't offer you permanent shelter from a man with Crow's resources and Crow's grudge. So the question is, what's the plan? Elira looked at Ronan. He was looking at her with the same direct quality he'd had since the road, waiting, she realized, for her to speak, not filling the space, letting her take it. I don't intend to go back, she said, and I don't intend to spend the rest of my life hiding. She paused, thinking it through as she said it. There's a settlement, Harlan's Creek, about 40 miles north and east in the next county. My mother's sister lives there. She's been there 15 years, married to a man named Cutter who runs a freighting operation. It's outside Crow's direct reach. She looked at Henry. Is that right? He doesn't have holdings up that way. Henry nodded slowly. His mining operations are all south and west. Harlan's Creek is out of his usual territory. He considered. It's not a simple 40 miles, though. The country between here and there. I know the country, Ronan said. He'd been listening carefully. I've ridden that route. There's a section through the canyon country that's hard going. 2 days minimum if we move carefully. 3 if we don't want to lose horses. Henry looked at him. You'd take her. Yes. Crow's men will track you. Yes. It's a bad piece of road in good conditions. It's a road, Ronan said simply. I've ridden worse. A silence settled over the kitchen. The fire in the stove ticked. Somewhere outside, a horse moved in the corral. Clara set a coffee cup in front of Elira and one in front of Ronan without a word. When? Henry asked. Ronan looked at Elira. Tomorrow morning, she said. Early. She looked down at the blue dress. I'll need different clothes for riding hard, and I'll need a pistol. She met Clara's eyes. If that's possible. Clara studied her. "I think we can manage that," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite approval, but was close to it. The recognition, perhaps, of a specific kind of person. Alira didn't sleep well. She'd been given a small room off the main hallway, clean and simply furnished, and she'd lain in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her. The sounds of a working place at rest, horses and cattle, and the distant creek, and the way the wind moved through the pines on the ridge. Familiar sounds, ranch sounds. She'd grown up with them, and now they were someone else's ranch, and her whole life was sitting somewhere between what it had been and what it was going to be. And she couldn't see the shape of what came next. She thought about her father. She'd been angry with him for months in small, accumulated ways. The way you're angry with someone you love who keeps making the same mistakes, which is a particular exhausting kind of angry. But this morning's anger was different. This was the anger of a line having been crossed, of something having been done that couldn't be undone. And yet, she'd seen his face on the street. She'd seen the thing in his eyes. She didn't forgive him. She wasn't there yet, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. But she thought about him sitting at that kitchen table in the gray pre-light, holding a cold cup of coffee, hands shaking, having spent however many hours sitting alone with what he'd done. She thought about what it was to be a person who loved their child and had failed them in the worst way. And she thought maybe someday she'd be able to look at him again without the anger being the first thing she felt. Someday wasn't tonight. She heard footsteps in the yard well after midnight and went to the window. Ronan was sitting on the fence of the near corral in the dark, smoking. Not restlessly, just sitting, the way some people need to be outside when they can't sleep. The horses moved around him without concern. She watched him for a moment. A stranger who'd walked into the middle of her disaster and offered himself as a shield without, as far as she could tell, any expectation of return. She didn't know what to do with that. Her experience of men was largely shaped by her father, who loved her and failed her, and Crow's type, who calculated everything. Ronan Vale didn't fit either template. He wasn't comfortable, she could see that, even from a window in the dark. There was something careful about how he held himself, like a man who'd learned to keep his feelings in specific containers and was good at it, but not always entirely at peace with it. But he was also undeniably present, fully there, not performing anything. She went back to bed. She still didn't sleep well, but she was, after a while, less troubled. They had a direction. They had a plan, however rough. She had clean clothes for the morning. Clara had found her trail pants and a good shirt and a jacket, and she had the pistol she'd asked for, a .36 Navy that had been Clara's and was well maintained. She knew how to use it. She was 18 years old, and her life had been turned inside out in a single week, and she was about to ride 40 difficult miles into uncertain territory with a man she'd known for approximately 6 hours. She was also, she realized in the dark, surprised but certain, not afraid. Angry, yes. Uncertain, yes. Not afraid. That felt important. That felt like something she needed to hold on to. She was up before the sun. So was Clara, who pressed food and coffee on both of them with quiet efficiency. Henry came out to the yard in the early gray to check the horses. He'd arranged a second mount for Alira, a stocky dun mare named Patience, solid and reliable, and to press a folded piece of paper into Ronan's hand. "Route notes," he said. "There's a family named Serrano about 15 miles out in the foothills. They know me. Tell them I sent you. They'll give you water and whatever information they have about the road north." Ronan nodded, pocketed the paper. "I appreciate it, Henry." The older man looked at him for a moment and then extended his hand. Ronan shook it. Henry looked at Alira. "Your mother was a good woman," he said. "People around here knew that. They'll remember it." She looked at him. "You knew her?" "She helped Clara through a hard winter years back, when we'd lost a child." He said it simply, without weight. "Just so you know, there are people in this valley who knew who she was." He stepped back. "Ride safe, and ride hard." They rode out in the first gray light, heading north, into country that got rougher and colder the higher they went, into the uncertainty of the miles ahead. Behind them, Red Hollow was waking up, and somewhere in that waking town, in a back room that smelled of cedar and something darker, Silas Crow was listening to Holt's report, and his jaw was set, and his pocket watch was in his hand, and he was telling the men in that room what was going to happen next. The morning was quiet. The mountains were turning gold at their peaks with the first light. Alira rode north and didn't look back. The north road out of Blackwood Ranch was good for exactly 3 miles before it became a suggestion. After that, it was a worn track through tall grass that the horses had to feel out with their feet. And after that, it was open country, rocky, rolling, crossed by dry creek beds that had water in them come spring and nothing but cracked mud in July. Ronan set a pace that was sustainable rather than fast, which Alira understood was the correct choice, and which cost her something anyway, that first hour, because every mile between her and Red Hollow felt like it needed to be wider. She didn't say that. She matched his pace and kept her eyes on the terrain ahead and let the distance grow at its own rate. The morning stayed cool longer than she expected, the shadow of the eastern ridge holding against the sun until well past 8, and they rode in that blue-gray light without speaking much. Ronan checked the terrain the way men who've spent years in open country check it. Not anxious, not constant, just a regular sweep of the horizon and the back trail that had become habit. She watched him do it and started doing it herself, which was probably the right instinct. The back trail was empty. That wouldn't last, but it was empty now. "How far to the Serrano place?" she asked, somewhere around the second hour. "Another 8 miles, give or take. We'll be there by midday if the ground stays reasonable." He glanced left toward a line of rock outcroppings that ran parallel to their path. "It doesn't always. You've ridden this before." "Twice. Once in spring, once in fall." He paused. "Never in summer. The water sources are different. My father used to say summer in the high country was either perfect or a disaster." "Your father's not wrong about that one." She registered the careful neutrality with which he said it. Not critical, not generous, just acknowledging the fact of what her father had said. She appreciated that. She wasn't ready for anyone to either defend Franklin Boone or condemn him, and Ronan seemed to understand that without being told. They rode on. The grass thinned and the ground got rockier as they climbed, and the horses picked their way with the careful intelligence of animals that knew their own footing. Patience, the dun mare Henry had given her, turned out to be well named. She moved through uncertain terrain with a methodical steadiness that Alira found herself grateful for. She'd ridden horses her whole life, and she'd ridden some that took your full attention and some that could be trusted to think for themselves. And patience was the second kind, which was what you wanted when you were also trying to watch a horizon and think through what you were riding toward. Around mid-morning, they stopped by a shallow creek that had enough water in it to let the horses drink. Alira swung down and walked to the edge and cupped water in her hands and drank, which tasted like rock and cold and the particular cleanness of the mountain runoff. She straightened up and looked north, where the mountains rose in a long, uneven wall. "The canyon country Henry mentioned," she said. "Where is that?" "Day and a half north, maybe 2. Ronan was checking Patience's left foreleg. She'd stepped slightly wrong on a loose rock a mile back. Nothing serious, but worth watching. "It's not the terrain that's the problem exactly. It's the exposure. Once we're in the canyon, there's one way through and one way back. And if someone gets ahead of us, we're boxed in." "Yes." She looked at the mountains. "Is there another route?" "There's a way that goes around the east side, adds nearly a full day. Terrain's harder, but more open." He stood, wiped his hands on his pants. "If we have time, it's the safer choice. If we don't have time, the canyon's faster." "The canyon's faster," he confirmed. She thought about Holt's face on the street, the way his hand had tightened on her arm, the way Crow's men had materialized at the edges of the crowd like they'd been waiting, like it was arranged. Crow was organized, she knew. He hadn't built what he'd built by being reactive. He thought ahead. "He'll anticipate the canyon," she said. Ronan looked at her. "Probably. So we go around." "It means an extra day on the road." "An extra day on the road is better than what happens if men get ahead of us into that canyon," she said. She felt the logic of it settle, clear and cold, like the water. "We go around." He nodded. Not like she'd convinced him of something he didn't already believe, but like she'd confirmed a decision that needed 2 people to make. They remounted and rode on. The Serrano homestead appeared in the early afternoon, tucked into a fold of the foothills, where 2 small ridges came together and made something close to a sheltered pocket. It was modest, a main house, a barn that had been repaired several times, a kitchen garden that was doing reasonably well despite the summer heat. a handful of chickens conducting their ongoing argument with existence in the yard. Functional. Inhabited by people who worked hard and had made the land give them what it had to offer. A man came out of the barn as they rode in. He was perhaps 40, lean, with dark eyes, and the kind of face that had weathered into its permanent expression, which was watchful but not hostile. He had a rifle in the crook of his arm, which he didn't raise but didn't put down either. "Tomas Serrano?" Ronan said. "Who's asking?" "Ronan Vale from Blackwood Ranch. Henry Alderman sent us." The name worked like a key in a lock. Tomas Serrano's posture changed, not relaxed exactly, but open. "Henry's man," he said. "I've heard of you." He looked at Elira with the same watchful assessment. "And her?" "Elira Boone. She's traveling north to family in Harlan's Creek." Thomas looked at them both for a long moment, then glanced past them at the back trail with the reflexive attention of a man who understood what it meant when travelers arrived from Red Hollow in a hurry and with that particular look about them. "Crow's people?" he said. "Likely," Ronan said. "Not yet visible, but we didn't wait around to see." Thomas made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Come in," he said. "I'll get Maria." Maria Serrano was a compact, quick-moving woman who took in the situation in approximately the time it took Elira to dismount and ask if there was somewhere she could wash her hands. Within 20 minutes, there was food on the table, water for the horses, and Tomas had sent his oldest boy, who was maybe 14, up the East Ridge with a glass to watch the southern approach. All of this done without drama, without performance, with the efficiency of a family that had dealt with difficult things before and knew the shape of them. They ate. Tomas sat at the table with a cup of coffee and asked careful questions, not prying, but building a picture. How far back were Crow's men? How many likely? What route were they planning? Ronan answered honestly. Elira contributed what she knew about Crow's organizational habits from things she'd heard in Red Hollow, who he trusted, how he generally deployed people when he wanted something recovered. Thomas listened with his elbows on the table and his coffee going cold. "He'll have someone watching the roads," Tomas said when they'd laid it out. "Not just following you, say, watching ahead too. He's done it before when there was a question of miners trying to leave before settling their debts." He looked at Ronan. "You know about the Mesa route? Goes east of the canyon and comes down through the back of Drummond's Valley?" Henry mentioned going around. "I know the general idea. I can give you specific landmarks. It adds time, but it also comes out above the usual approaches, which means anyone waiting at the canyon won't see you coming." He paused. "There's a stretch through some shale country about 20 miles out that's rough on horses. You'll want to walk them through it." "How long is the shale stretch?" 3 miles, maybe a little more." Ronan nodded. "We can manage that." Elira was watching Tomas Serrano during this exchange, and she was thinking about what it meant that he was giving them this information, this level of specific and useful help, to people he'd met 2 hours ago on the word of a man he trusted. She thought about Henry Alderman saying stay as long as you need, about Clara finding her clothes and the pistol, about the woman in Red Hollow who'd touched her arm as she passed. "Why are you helping us?" she asked Tomas directly. He looked at her. He had the kind of eyes that didn't pretend things. "Crow's men came through here 6 months ago," he said, "looking for a miner who'd walked off one of his operations rather than keep working conditions that were killing people. They were not polite about the asking." He set down his cup. "I told them I hadn't seen the man, which was true, and they were unpleasant about it anyway." He held her gaze. "Any friend of Henry Alderman's is someone I'll help. And anyone running from Silas Crow is someone whose situation I understand personally." She nodded. She didn't say anything because it didn't need anything said. The boy came down from the ridge an hour later. 3 riders, he said, about 8 miles south and moving at a tracking pace. Not racing, not leisurely. The deliberate controlled movement of men following a trail. Thomas thanked him with the quietness of a father who'd trained his children to be calm in difficult situations. "You should go," he said. "Not running, just don't wait." They left within the half hour. Tomas gave Ronan a hand-sketched map of the Mesa route on a piece of brown paper, specific enough to be useful and detailed enough to show that he'd traveled it himself. Maria pressed food into their saddlebags without being asked. The boy stood at the barn door and watched them go with the serious face of someone young enough to think this was adventure, and old enough to know it wasn't only that. The afternoon unfolded hard. The mesa route took them up a long incline through scrub oak and scattered pine, where the ground was dry and loose and the horses worked for their footing. The air thinned as they climbed, not dangerously, but perceptibly, and the heat of the valley fell away and was replaced by something cooler that tasted of altitude and rock. Neither of them talked much. There was a quality to hard terrain that demanded a certain amount of attention, and they both gave it. Watching their horses and watching the ground and watching the sky, which was building something in the west, a slow accumulation of cloud that might mean weather by evening. "Storm coming," Elira said at one point. "Tomorrow probably," Ronan said. "Maybe tonight if it moves faster than it looks like." "Does that help us or hurt us?" He thought about it. "Both," he said. "Covers our tracks. Also makes the high ground treacherous." "We can't stay high overnight then." "No, we'll need to find lower ground before dark." They did. There was a spot Tomas's map marked as a good shelter, the remains of an old line camp, mostly collapsed, but with enough standing structure to break wind and enough flat ground nearby for the horses. They reached it as the light was going gold, and the clouds in the west had darkened and begun moving faster. The structure was as described, more ruins than shelter, but functional in the way that rough things can be functional. 3 walls and part of a 4th, and what remained of a roof on one corner, enough to create a pocket of relative protection. Ronan unsaddled the horses and staked them where they had grass and some cover. Elira gathered what dry wood she could find, not much but enough, and made a small fire in the corner where the walls still stood, keeping it low and sheltered, more for warmth than visibility because the temperature was dropping fast with the coming weather. They ate what Maria had packed, bread, cold meat, dried fruit, and sat on opposite sides of the small fire in a silence that was, Elira thought, different in character from the silence of the road. Less functional, more like 2 people who were in the same space and aware of each other and had run out of immediate practical problems to solve and weren't sure what came next. "Tell me something," she said. Ronan looked at her across the fire. "What kind of something?" "Something true. About yourself." She watched the fire for a moment. "We've been riding together all day, and I know your name and your job and that you're from New Mexico and that you think ahead well enough to be useful in a crisis. I don't know anything else." He was quiet for a moment in the way that she'd started to recognize meant he was actually thinking about what she'd said rather than manufacturing a response. "I had a brother," he said. "Younger. He died when I was 22. Fever. It happened fast the way those things do, and I wasn't there when it happened. I was working a cattle drive 60 miles away, and by the time word reached me, it was already finished." He paused. "I've been moving ever since. Not running from it exactly, just moving seemed easier than staying in places that remembered him." She looked at him. The firelight did something to his face, softened the careful steadiness of it, showed the thing underneath that he kept in its container. "How long ago was that?" she asked. 7 years. That's a long time to be moving." "Yes," he said. He didn't offer anything more, but he'd given her something real, and she understood the value of that. She'd asked for something true, and he'd offered a hard thing rather than an easy one. That said something. "My mother died 4 years ago," she said. "Not sudden. It was slow. 6 months of slow. And the worst part wasn't the end. It was watching my father come apart in those 6 months and not knowing how to help either of them." She looked at the fire. "He and I were closest to her. The 3 of us we functioned. After she was gone, we sort of didn't know how to be around each other without her in the middle. And he started gambling. He always gambled a little. After she died, he did it the way some people drink, not for fun anymore, for somewhere to put the weight." She pulled her jacket tighter because the temperature had dropped another degree and the wind was picking up outside their 3-wall shelter. "I don't excuse it. I just understand the shape of it. That doesn't make it hurt less." The fire made small sounds. The horses shifted and settled outside. "What's your aunt like?" Ronan asked. "The one in Harlan's Creek." Elira's face shifted slightly. Not a full smile, but the shadow of one, which was different from the expression she'd worn for most of the day. "Stubborn," she said. "More stubborn than my mother was, and my mother could hold a position through an earthquake. Her name is Della. She left the valley 15 years ago, when the man she wanted to marry wasn't approved of by my grandfather, And she just went, wrote one letter to say where she was and that she was married and happy, and that grandfather could sit on his own opinion. She paused. I've only met her twice, but she's the only person I know who's built something entirely on her own terms. She sounds like someone worth writing to, Ronan said. Yes, Elira said. She does. The storm arrived around midnight. She heard it come. First the change in wind, then the distant sound that became less distant rapidly, then the first rain hitting what remained of the roof above them in irregular drops that quickly became steady. She'd moved her bedroll into the most sheltered corner and pulled her jacket over herself and was not precisely warm but was not soaked either, which was the achievable standard. She heard Ronan get up once to check the horses. Heard him come back. The rain came harder for a while and then settled into a steady determination that suggested it had made a commitment and intended to honor it. She lay in the dark and listened and thought about Tomas Serrano's oldest boy, watching the southern approach from the ridge with a glass, serious-faced and calm. She thought about the 3 riders Holt had sent, 8 miles back when they'd left, tracking pace, steady. They'd have lost the trail in the rain. They'd have to stop and shelter somewhere themselves, or push through it and risk the horses on wet ground. They'd gained ground tonight. The storm was an inconvenience and also a kind of help, and she recognized that this was how things often worked. The same circumstance that made one thing harder made another thing possible. And she'd need to keep seeing it that way, keep finding what was useful in whatever came at them rather than just what was hard about it. That was something her mother used to say, not in those words, but in the habit of it, in the way she'd move through difficulty, which was not cheerfully and not without complaint, but with a kind of practical forward motion that refused to stop and stare at the obstacle longer than it took to understand its shape. Elira was not her mother. She knew that. She was angrier and less patient and more likely to do something abrupt. But she had that quality of forward motion in her, she thought. She could feel it even now, in the dark, in the rain, in the ruins of a line camp 40 miles from the only life she'd known. She was moving. She was going somewhere. She'd chosen it. That had to count for something. In the morning, the storm had passed and left the world washed and smelling of pine resin and wet earth. And the eastern sky was clear and cold, and the horses were damp but sound, and Ronan had a small fire going by the time she was awake, which was the most practical kindness she could think of. She crouched by the fire with her hands wrapped around a cup of camp coffee, strong and bitter, and exactly right, and looked at the sky and thought about what the day held. How far to the shale section Tomas mentioned? She asked. 6 miles, maybe. We should hit it by mid-morning. He poured himself coffee and sat back on his heels. His hair was slightly damp from checking the horses in the rain, and there was a streak of mud on his left boot. The good news is the rain will have settled the dust. The bad news is wet shale is worse than dry. Then we walk carefully. Yes. And those 3 riders from yesterday? Lost the trail last night, but they know the general direction. They'll reacquire. He looked at the horizon, doing the calculation. We've got today. Maybe part of tomorrow. After that, they'll have figured out we went around the canyon. She thought about the map Tomas had given them. The Mesa route's advantage was position. It came out above the usual approaches, but it was an advantage in space, not necessarily time. We need to keep moving, she said. Yes. She stood, set down the cup, and started breaking down the camp with the efficiency of someone who'd done it before, who knew that the things you attended to first thing in the morning determined what the rest of the day had room to be. Behind them, back down the wet southern slopes, 3 riders were already moving again, following an interrupted trail, patient and methodical, in the way that men who've been paid well and promised more are patient and methodical. And back in Red Hollow, Silas Crow was eating breakfast at his private table in the back room of the saloon and listening to his second report of the morning, and his pocket watch was in his hand, and the face he made when Holt finished talking was not the face of a man who was going to let this go. It was the face of a man who was recalculating. That face was, in its way, more dangerous than anything he'd shown on the street. The shale section arrived exactly where Tomas said it would, a long traverse across a slope where the rock had broken into irregular plates that shifted and grated underfoot and would have been treacherous to ride. They dismounted and led the horses through on foot, picking each step, letting the animals find their own footing and not rushing them. Elira's boots slipped twice, both times caught. The horses picked through with the instinctive sureness that horses have on bad ground when you give them the time they need. It took the better part of 2 hours. When they cleared the shale and came out onto a long ridge with open country below, she stopped and looked back at what they'd come through and felt something in her chest that was partly simple relief and partly something she'd have a hard time naming: the satisfaction of a hard thing done. The particular solid feeling of having moved through something that didn't have a shortcut. "That's the worst of it," Ronan said, coming up beside her. "Of the terrain, you mean?" He looked at her. A pause. "Yes," he said. "Of the terrain." She understood what he wasn't saying, which was that the terrain was not actually the worst of what was still ahead of them. She looked north, where the ridgelines rolled away in long folds toward the distance, and somewhere in that distance was Harlan's Creek and Della Cutter, and a life she was going to have to build from whatever she could carry with her. She was carrying herself. She was carrying what her mother had taught her. She was carrying a pistol and a borrowed horse and a braid that needed redoing, and a heart that was still deciding exactly how much it had to be angry about before it could start letting anything else in. "All right," she said, "let's keep going." They mounted and rode north into the open country, into the second day, carrying the morning behind them like something that had already shaped them both in ways they wouldn't fully understand until later. The second day opened clear and cold, the kind of morning that makes the world look sharp-edged and permanent, like everything has been cut from stone. They were moving by first light, following the ridge north before dropping into the long valley that Tomas's map called Drummond's, where the grass grew knee-high on the horses, and the creek ran wide and shallow, and the mountains stood back from the land like they were giving it room to breathe. It was beautiful country. Alira noted that fact the way you note a thing that deserves acknowledgement even when you're in no position to enjoy it. The way you might notice a good meal you're eating too fast because you have somewhere to be. They watered the horses at the creek and pushed on. By mid-morning, the valley had narrowed and the walls on either side had come up higher, not yet canyon country, but moving toward it, and the trail they were following, more of a game track than anything else, widened slightly by occasional use, had gotten rockier underfoot. Patience picked through it without complaint. The brown gelding Ronan rode, whose name she'd learned was called Dust, which she thought was either very poetic or very practical depending on how you looked at it, moved with the same steady reliability he'd shown since Red Hollow. She'd been watching the back trail with increasing frequency, not because she'd seen anything, because she hadn't, and the absence of visible pursuit had started to feel less like safety and more like a held breath. "You keep looking south," Ronan said. "I keep thinking we should have seen something by now," she said. "Either them behind us or sign that they've given up. Nothing feels wrong." "Nothing feels wrong" isn't the same as nothing being wrong. That's exactly what I mean. He looked back himself. The valley behind them was empty and golden and perfectly calm. He turned forward again and his jaw worked slightly, a small motion she'd started to read as him thinking through something he didn't like the shape of. "Tomas said Crow anticipated routes," she said, "that he'd have people watching ahead, not just following. I've been thinking about that. And the Mesa route gets us above the standard approaches. That's good. But it assumes Crow is thinking about the canyon specifically. If he's thinking bigger than that," he paused. "If he's thinking about Harlan's Creek itself, about where you're going rather than how you're getting there." The cold of it hit her before the words finished. She'd been thinking about this as a chase, people behind her, trying to close the distance. She hadn't fully considered the possibility that someone might already be ahead. "He knows about Della," she said. Not a question, more like watching a thing take shape. "Does he?" She thought about it honestly. My father knew. He might have mentioned family. He might have said something when Crow was pressing him about alternatives, about where I might go. He wouldn't have done it to hurt me, but he... She stopped. "He talks when he's nervous. Always has." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "Then we should move like someone's waiting at the other end and not just following from behind." "What does that change?" "How we come into Harlan's Creek. We don't ride in on the main road." He glanced at Thomas's map, which he'd been keeping in his chest pocket. "There's a Cutter name on there. Your aunt's husband. Freighting operation. Freighters have supply routes, back roads, loading areas that aren't on the main approach into town. We find one of those. If we can figure out which ones, it's a guess." Everything we've done since Saturday is a guess, she said. It hasn't killed us yet. The corner of his mouth moved. Fair point. They pushed their pace for the next 2 hours, eating up the valley while the sun climbed and the day warmed and the mountains on either side threw long shadows that slowly shortened and retreated. The country was wild and mostly empty. No ranches out this far, no visible homesteads, nothing that moved except birds, and once a small herd of pronghorn that watched them pass from 300 yards with mild alarm and then resumed grazing. The ambush, when it came, didn't announce itself. That was the thing about ambushes. The successful ones didn't. There was no dramatic presentation, no moment where the world told you to brace. One moment, the trail ahead was empty where it curved around a low outcropping of red rock, and the next moment there were 2 men on horseback sitting in the middle of it, and a third man visible on the rocks above to the left, and the arithmetic of the situation was immediately and brutally clear. Alira felt everything happen at once. Patience shine sideways. Ronan's arm coming across in front of her by reflex, both of them pulling up hard, the horses dancing under the sudden stop. The 2 men on the trail were armed and not pointing yet, but the potential was fully present. The man on the rocks above had a rifle across his knees. The whole thing had the arranged quality of people who'd been waiting for a while and were satisfied that the waiting was over. The larger of the 2 men on the trail was one she didn't recognize, not Holt, not any of Crow's usual faces from Red Hollow. Hired from somewhere else, she thought. Crow had reach beyond the county. Vale, the man said, knowing Ronan's name already. And Miss Boone, you've made this considerably harder than it needed to be. Ronan hadn't moved. Both his hands were visible, easy on the reins, which was either genuine calm or the performance of it. She couldn't entirely tell and suspected the line between those things in him was thin. What's your name? Ronan said. Doesn't matter. Humor me. The man looked at him with the flat assessment of a professional. Garrett, he said. I work for Mr. Crow. You've probably figured that part out. How'd you get ahead of us? Garrett's expression didn't change. Didn't follow you, came north by the main road and cut in from the east. A brief pause that was as close to satisfaction as his face seemed to get. Mr. Crow had some ideas about where you were headed, and Mr. Boone confirmed that Miss Boone had family in Harlan's Creek. Elira's jaw tightened. She'd known it. She'd known it and said it out loud to Ronan, and it was still a cold thing to hear confirmed. So, Garrett said, we're going to have a calm conversation about how this goes from here. No one needs to get shot. Miss Boone comes back to Red Hollow. Mr. Vale? He glanced at Ronan with something that was almost neutrality and almost something harder. Mr. Vale makes a different choice about which fights are his business. And if I don't agree with that arrangement, Alira said. Garrett looked at her. He was, she thought, a man who didn't underestimate people, but also didn't particularly care about what they wanted. The job was the job. I don't think you're really in a position. The man on the rocks, Ronan said, and his voice had dropped to something so quiet she almost missed the change, has been shifting his weight for the last 90 seconds. He's been watching me, not her, which means his instructions prioritize keeping me contained, which means he's going to move in the next few seconds whether or not we've finished talking. A beat. A single, suspended beat. Garrett's face changed. Ronan went sideways off dust, in a motion that was not graceful and not clean, but was fast. He hit the ground and came up moving, and the shot from the rocks cracked across the valley walls and kicked up dirt 4 feet from where he'd been sitting on the horse. The horses screamed and bolted sideways. Alira stayed in the saddle by sheer animal instinct, her legs clamping down, one hand finding Patience's mane. What followed was not the organized confrontation of men who have a plan and execute it. It was noise and dust and the specific chaos of horses and gunfire in a confined space. The second man from the trail came at her and she hauled Patience sideways, and the man went past and she got her hand on the pistol, Clara's .36 Navy, which she'd been wearing all day, and which was real and loaded, and which she pulled now without thinking. In the way that you do things your hands have practiced many times before. She didn't shoot him. He'd gone past and was wheeling around, and she had maybe 3 seconds before he completed the turn, and she used those 3 seconds to put Patience into a dead run toward the gap between the rocks to the right, which was narrow and rough, but was the direction nobody was currently standing in. Behind her she heard Ronan's voice. not calling to her, not words, just a short, sharp sound that meant go. And she went. Patience was not a fast horse. She was steady and smart, and those qualities were more useful than speed on the ground they were crossing. Uneven, rock-studded, the kind of terrain where a fast horse gets itself killed and a sensible one survives. Elira gave her her head and held on, and they went through the gap and up a short slope and around a shoulder of rock, and then the immediate sound of pursuit was behind her, and she pulled up, breathing hard, pistol still in her hand. She could hear shooting. Not many shots. 3, 4, a pause, one more. Then nothing. The silence after gunfire has a specific quality. It's not actually silence because your ears are ringing and the landscape is still making its small sounds, but it has the felt quality of silence, the sudden absence of the thing that had been demanding all of your attention. She waited. A minute, 2. The longest 2 minutes she'd experienced in a life that had recently provided strong competition for that title. Then Ronan came around the shoulder of rock on foot, leading dust by the reins. He had a tear in the left shoulder of his jacket that wasn't there before, and his face was set in a way that told her something had happened, but he was intact and functional. She exhaled something that wasn't quite a word. "You're all right," he said. Not a question. He was looking at her, assessing. "Yes. You?" He glanced at his shoulder. "Grazed. It's not deep." He said it the way people say things when they mean it hurts, and I'm not going to make a production of it. The men... Garrett's gone. Took the other man with him. The one on the rocks. He paused. He won't be following anyone. She looked at him steadily. He met her eyes, and there was nothing evasive in his face, just the flat, unembellished fact of what had happened. She didn't ask for more than that. She understood that he'd done what the situation demanded, and that examining it too closely right now served neither of them. "How bad is the shoulder?" "I need to bind it and keep riding." He looked at Dust with a critical eye. The horse was agitated but uninjured, legs clear. "He's fine. You?" She looked at Patience. Her own hands were steadier than she expected. "We're both fine." She looked down at the pistol she was still holding and holstered it with a motion that felt deliberate. Garrett went back to Crow. "Yes." "Which means Crow knows exactly where we are and which direction we're going." "Yes." She thought about that for a moment. The calculation had changed. Garrett getting ahead of them had been the thing they'd feared, and it had happened, and they'd come through it. But the information Garrett now carried back made everything that followed more complicated. Crow knew the destination. He knew they were close. He would move faster now. "We can't go to Della's place directly," she said. "No. Even if we get there first, it puts her in it." She felt that settle, the weight of it. She'd been riding toward her aunt for 2 days, and now the destination itself was a problem. "Crow's men come to Harlan's Creek. They'll go to Cutter's freight operation first. That's where we'd be." "So we need to get to Harlan's Creek and have something arranged before they get there," Ronan said. "Warning the town. Getting enough people aware that Crow's men can't just walk in and take anyone. The sheriff in Harlan's Creek, I don't know him. I don't know if he's straight or if Crow has reached there." "Della would know," Elira said. "She's been there 15 years. She knows who's who." "Then we need to get to Della before Crow's men do, and we need to do it quietly." He looked at the slope above them. "There's a way to come into the valley from the North Ridge instead of the main road. It'll take most of what's left of today, and we'll be riding in the dark for the last stretch. Can you ride on that shoulder?" He gave her a look that was the expression of a man who considers that question slightly beside the point. "Bind it," she said, and then yes. She had a piece of clean cloth in her saddlebag. She'd put it there that morning at the line camp, following the habit of someone raised to be practical about the possibility of injury. She made him take off the jacket and the shirt beneath. The wound was a groove through the muscle of the outer shoulder, ugly and bleeding more than she liked, but Ronan had been right that it wasn't deep. The bone was untouched. She cleaned it with water from her canteen, pressed the cloth against it, bound it firm with strips torn from the hem of her mother's blue dress, which she'd folded in the bottom of the saddlebag because she hadn't been able to leave it behind. He didn't make a sound while she worked. His jaw was set, and his eyes were on the middle distance, and she could feel the deliberate quality of his stillness, the effort of choosing not to react. She tied off the last strip and sat back. "It'll hold for today," she said. It needs proper attention when we get there. It'll get it. I'm not asking, she said. I'm telling you, it needs attention. That's not negotiable. He looked at her. Something passed through his expression that wasn't quite humor and wasn't quite surprise and was somewhere in the territory of a man recalibrating, again, what he'd expected. All right, he said. They rode. The afternoon was long and increasingly hard. The North Ridge approach that Ronan had mentioned was not a trail anyone had bothered to improve. It was the ghost of a path through dense timber that required constant attention and offered nothing in return except the knowledge that it was not the way Crow's men were expecting them. They moved slowly. Ronan rode with his left arm held slightly away from his body, in the way you do when something hurts and you're managing it rather than addressing it. Elira rode close enough to watch him without being obvious about it. He was pale around the edges of his face in a way that had grown more pronounced over the last 2 hours, and she knew from basic experience that a wound that seems manageable in the first hour has a way of making its presence more fully known as the day goes on. She kept her own counsel on this and rode and watched and calculated the miles. They talked in the stretches where the terrain allowed it. Not about the situation, they'd said what needed to be said about that. About other things. She told him about her mother's garden, which had been the best kitchen garden in the valley by general agreement, and how her mother had talked to the plants in a low, continuous murmur while she worked that Elira had always found embarrassing as a child, and now would have given a great deal to hear again. He told her about a horse he'd owned in New Mexico that had been half wild and entirely unreasonable, and the best animal he'd ever ridden, and how it had taken him 6 months to earn any kind of working relationship with the creature, and another 6 months before he'd have called it trust. What happened to it? She asked. Sold it when I came north. The man I sold it to knew horses. I told him about the 6 months. He paused. Told him the horse would decide when it was ready and not before, and to not rush it. Did he listen? I don't know, he said. I hope so. The sky went orange and then red, and then the long blue of early evening, and the timber around them began to thin, and below them, dropping away in a long slope of open grassland, she saw the lights of Harlan's Creek, scattered, warm, the particular constellation of a small town at the end of its working day. She stopped Patience and looked at it for a long moment. She'd been moving toward this for 2 days. The act of seeing it made it real in a different way than it had been while it was still a direction and a plan. It was an actual place. It had actual people in it, including one person who'd built her life on her own terms and might, Elira thought, know what to say to a woman who was trying to figure out how to do the same. Which side do Cutter's freight buildings sit on? Ronan asked. She pulled herself back to the practical. West side of town, I think. My mother mentioned it once. She said Della wrote that her husband ran his operation from the west end, where the wagon road came in from the hills. Then we go east first, come around and approach from the north. He looked at the shoulder of hill that curved toward the town's far side. Quieter. They went east and then north and came into Harlan's Creek from a direction that no one watching the main approaches would have been covering, moving through the back streets of the town's edge, a lumber yard, a tannery that smelled like itself from 2 blocks away, a row of modest houses with their windows lit against the dark. The town was not large. It was the right size for a freighting hub, for a place that existed because of its position on a route rather than because of anything intrinsic to the land itself. Elira had the address from a letter her mother had kept. She'd memorized it 3 years ago without quite knowing why. Some instinct about the usefulness of knowing where Della was. She guided them through the back streets by the memory of a hand-drawn map her mother had made from Della's description, which was imprecise but gave enough landmarks. The big cottonwood at the north end of Maine, the building with the red-painted roof that served as the freight office, the house behind it with the kitchen garden on the east side. The kitchen garden was still there, even in the dark. She could see the shapes of it, the organized rows, the bean poles, the careful use of limited space. Something about it made her throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected. She dismounted at the back fence. Ronan did the same, more slowly than earlier, and she noted it and said nothing. She went to the back door and knocked, a long moment. Then the sound of movement inside. Quick, purposeful footsteps, the kind made by someone who moves with intention. A light appeared at the small window beside the door. A pause while whoever was inside assessed the situation with the caution of a woman who'd learned to be careful before opening doors after dark. Then the door opened. Della Cutter was 53 years old and had her sister's eyes, which were Alira's mother's eyes, which Alira had spent her whole life seeing only in a mirror, and which now confronted her in the face of a stranger who was not a stranger, and the force of that was larger than she'd prepared for. Della looked at her. Her expression moved through several things rapidly. Recognition, not of Alira specifically, but of the bloodline, the resemblance. Then something else. Something that settled. "You're Ruth's girl," she said. "Yes," Alira said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. Della looked past her at Ronan, who was standing at the fence in the dark with one hand on the gatepost in a way that was either relaxed or using the post for support. Possibly both. "He needs to come inside," Alira said. "He's been shot." "I can see that," Della said. She pushed the door wider. "Both of you, come in. Don't stand there advertising yourselves." The kitchen was warm and smelled of the same things kitchens always smell of when people actually use them. And Alira stepped across the threshold into it and felt not safe, because the situation wasn't safe, and she was clear-eyed enough to know it, but something adjacent. Something that was the feeling of having arrived at the next thing. Whatever the next thing was going to be. Della was already moving, calling for her husband, pulling a chair out from the table, going for the shelf where she kept her medical supplies, with the focused efficiency of a woman who'd been dealing with practical emergencies for decades and found them manageable. A man came in from the front room. James Cutter, tall and bearded and in his late 50s, wearing the look of someone pulled from the edge of sleep. He took in the situation with the speed of a man accustomed to unexpected developments and said only, "What do we need?" "Hot water," Della said. "The small lamp from the study. And James, go around to Aldred's place and bring him back. Tell him it's the shoulder, no fever yet." Cutter was already moving. Ronan had made it to the chair and was sitting in it with the particular stillness of someone whose body has spent the last several hours being made to do things and has reached the end of its patience with the effort. He looked, in the lamplight, considerably more pale than he'd looked on the ridge, and the binding on his shoulder had soaked through in one corner. Alira sat across from him. She put her hands on the table where she could see them, both of them, steadier than they'd been since the ambush at the rocks. And she looked at the man across from her who had walked into the middle of Red Hollow's main street with a rifle and changed the shape of her life. And she thought about what it was that he'd said when she'd asked him why. Because nobody else was going to. He looked back at her. His eyes were tired and direct, and in them she saw the thing she'd been seeing since Saturday. That quality of simply looking at what was there. Not at what he wanted it to be. Not at what was easier to see. At the actual thing in front of him. "We made it," she said. He considered this. "Part of the way," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Part of the way." Della set a bowl of water on the table and began unwinding the strips of blue cotton from his shoulder with quick, practiced hands. She looked at Alira over Ronan's head, a look that contained several things, including, Alira thought, a question that Della was smart enough to know wasn't the right moment to ask. Outside the window, Harlan's Creek was quiet. The lights of the main street were visible from here. Orange and steady, the ordinary illumination of a small town's ordinary night. Somewhere south of those lights, on a road that covered the distance faster on a horse ridden hard, Garrett was riding back to Silas Crow with a report that would change the shape of what came next. And in a back room that smelled of cedar and calculation, a man was going to listen to that report with his pocket watch in his hand, and he was going to stop thinking about this as a matter of debt and inconvenience, and start thinking about it as something personal. That was the shift. That was the thing that made what was coming different from what had already come. But that was still south of here, and right now there was lamplight, and a woman with her mother's eyes who moved through emergencies like she'd been built for them. And Alira Boone was sitting at a kitchen table in the town she'd been riding toward for 2 days, and her hands were steady, and she was breathing. That was enough for this particular moment. The doctor Della had sent for, a man named Aldred, small and precise and smelling faintly of tobacco, arrived within 20 minutes and examined Ronan's shoulder with the focused attention of someone who'd seen worse and was not distressed by what he was looking at. "Clean enough," he said. "Whoever bound this knew what they were doing." He glanced at Alira briefly. "Needs stitching. He'll have full use of it if he doesn't do anything stupid with it for 2 weeks. Define stupid, Ronan said. Getting shot again would qualify, Aldred said without looking up from his work. Beyond that, use your judgment. Ronan looked at the ceiling while Aldred worked and didn't make a sound, which Elira thought was either impressive willpower or the product of having been in enough painful situations that he'd made a private accommodation with pain somewhere along the way. She sat across the table and watched, and let herself be still for the first time in 2 days, which her body received with the grateful heaviness of something that had been running on obligation and was only now remembering it was tired. Della sat beside her, not hovering, just present. She'd put coffee on the stove and a plate of food on the table that neither of them had touched yet, and she was watching Elira with those eyes that were her mother's eyes, and the quiet between them was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of two people who have a great deal to say to each other and understand that this particular moment is not the right one. James Cutter came back from wherever he'd been during the medical business and sat at the far end of the table with the contained calm of a man who ran a freighting operation and had therefore dealt with enough unexpected complications to have developed a general policy of addressing them methodically rather than dramatically. "Tell me what we're working with," he said. He looked at Elira. "All of it. I need to understand the full shape of the thing." She told him. She went through it from the kitchen table Wednesday morning to the back door of his house tonight, and she was direct and complete and didn't soften the parts about her father or the parts about the ambush in the valley or the parts about what Garrett had now carried back to Crow. Cutter listened the way experienced people listen, without interrupting, without reassuring gestures, with the steady attention of someone building a picture. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning a coffee cup in his hands. "Crow's reached this far before," he said. "Not personally, but his money has. There's a timber operation 40 miles south of here that he has holdings in, which means he has some contacts in the county." He looked at Ronan, who was sitting still while Aldred finished. "The sheriff here, man named Purcell. He's straight. I've known him 12 years. Crow doesn't have him." "You're certain," Ronan said. "As certain as I am about anything involving human beings, which means mostly certain with the understanding that I've been wrong before." He set the cup down. "But I've watched Purcell work. He's an honest man who takes the law at its word, which means he needs to see something he can act on. Someone telling him Crow is coming isn't enough. He'll need to see it arrive." "What happens when it does arrive?" Elira asked. "What happens is I've spent 12 years building relationships in this town, and Crow has spent 0. Cutter looked at her steadily. "He has money and reach, but not presence here. That matters. People defend what's theirs, and this community is mine and Della's, and if Crow's men come into it with the intention of taking someone out by force—" He paused. "That's not an abstraction. That's a direct threat to every person in this valley who's built something they don't want someone else to walk in and take." Della put her hand briefly on Elira's arm. Not holding, just contact, the same as the woman in Red Hollow Street. That specific human gesture of acknowledging that someone is there. "He's not wrong," she said. "This is a town that is held against harder things than one man's wounded pride." "It's not just pride," Elira said. "It's about what he can't allow to exist. If I walk away and build something, and it's visible, and it's mine, it means the papers he made my father sign didn't mean what he intended them to mean. A man like Crow can't let that stand." Cutter nodded slowly. "Then we need to be ready before he decides to make his argument in person." Aldred finished with Ronan's shoulder, wrapped it properly, gave him instructions he accepted without comment, and Elira committed to memory on the understanding that Ronan's relationship with following medical advice was probably inconsistent. Aldred packed his bag and paused at the door. "I don't know what's coming," he said, with the directness of a man who's decided the situation warrants it, "but I've got a rifle and I know how to use it. You need a doctor on hand when things happen. People tend to need one. I'll make myself available." He looked at Cutter. "James?" And left. The kitchen was quieter after that. Ronan ate, slowly, with the careful focus of someone whose body is insisting on fuel and whose pride is just barely allowing the concession. And Elira ate too, the food tasting of the specific way things taste when you've been running on fear and forward motion for 2 days, and your body suddenly remembers what normal hunger is. Della watched both of them with the shrewd attention of a woman who'd been reading people across a kitchen table for 53 years. You need sleep, she said, when the plates were mostly clear. Both of you, whatever comes tomorrow. And something will come tomorrow. I'm not naive about that. You'll meet it better rested than you are now. I don't think I can sleep, Elira said honestly. You don't have to sleep. You have to lie down and be horizontal and let your body have what you owe it. Della stood. There's a room off the back hall. 2 beds. It was the boys' room before they grew up and moved on. She looked at Ronan with a level practicality that acknowledged the situation without making anything of it. You'll sleep better with the arm elevated. I'll get another pillow. Ronan looked faintly like a man who wanted to argue and had correctly assessed that it would not go well for him. Thank you, he said instead. The room was small and dark and smelled of cedar and old wood, and the particular mustiness of a space that hadn't been occupied in a while but had been maintained. Elira lay on top of the covers in her clothes because the idea of being less than fully dressed in the current circumstances felt wrong, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to Ronan's breathing on the other side of the room, even out gradually into the slower rhythm of genuine sleep, which was a sound she found unexpectedly settling. She thought about her father. She did this the way you probe a sore tooth, carefully, assessing the shape and depth of the damage. He'd given Garrett the information about Della, not with malice, she believed that, but out of the weakness of a man under pressure saying more than he intended to the wrong person. He'd been doing that her whole life in smaller ways, and now he'd done it in the largest possible way, and men had ridden ahead to cut her off, and a man she'd known for 3 days had been shot in the shoulder because of it. And yet, the face on the street, the exhausted, complicated love. She didn't resolve anything. She let the thing sit unresolved because that was where it honestly was. And pretending otherwise would have been a lie, she told herself. And she had no patience for that kind of lie tonight. She slept. She didn't know exactly when it happened, but it did. In the morning, Harlan's Creek was busy with its ordinary life. The freight wagons moving on the western road, the smell of cook fires, the sound of a town conducting itself. And Cutter had been up for 2 hours already by the time Elira came into the kitchen. He'd been out and back, and he told her what he'd learned the way he told her everything, directly and without decoration. 2 of Crow's men had arrived in town the previous evening and taken a room at the boarding house on Main. They were asking careful questions about the Cutter freight operation, about who'd come in from the South Road recently, in the way that people ask careful questions when they're trying to get information without revealing why they want it. The boarding house owner, a woman named Mrs. Pratt, who had a particular sensitivity to men who asked careful questions, had mentioned it to her neighbor, whose husband was one of Cutter's drivers, and the information had made its way to Cutter's ear by 6 in the morning. So they're already here, Ronan said. He'd come in from the back room behind Elira, his arm in a sling Della had fashioned, his face carrying the specific look of a man who'd slept on a wound and was now in the process of honestly assessing what he was capable of. 2 of them, Cutter said, advanced men most likely. Crow himself, if he's coming, is still a day out, maybe 2. But he'll come. Men like that have to come in person once it becomes personal. He'll bring more, Elira said. He won't come to Harlan's Creek with 2 men and expect that to be enough. Not after... She paused. Not after the valley. No, Ronan agreed. He'll come heavy. Cutter nodded. Which gives us today, possibly tonight. He looked at them both. I spoke with Purcell this morning. The sheriff, Elira said, told him the situation plainly. Told him there were armed men already in town asking questions about a woman who'd arrived in my home. Told him there would likely be more coming and that their intention was to remove her by force. He paused. He listened. He's a man who listens all the way through before he speaks, which I've always appreciated about him. What did he say? Ronan asked. He said that any armed party entering his town with the intention of removing a person against their will would be met as what it is, which is armed assault and unlawful detention, and that he had no particular interest in Silas Crow's business arrangements. Cutter drank his coffee. He also said he'd be wanting to speak with Miss Boone directly, to hear the situation from her because he's thorough that way. Elira went to see Purcell mid-morning. He was a large, unhurried man in his mid-40s who occupied his office the way certain men occupy spaces, not aggressively but completely, as if the room had been built to his specific dimensions. He had a deputy, a young man who was trying very hard to appear competent and succeeding moderately, and he had a desk covered in papers and a rifle on the wall behind him, that was clean and oiled and present in the way that tools are present when they're maintained by someone who intends to use them. He listened to Alira the same way Cutter had listened, all the way through. He asked 3 questions when she finished, all of them specific and useful. What the papers her father had signed actually said as far as she knew, whether Crow had made any direct communication to her personally regarding his intentions, and whether she'd entered Harlan's Creek of her own free will. She answered honestly and completely. Purcell leaned back in his chair when she was done and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man organizing his thoughts into an order that satisfied him. "The papers your father signed," he said finally, "even in the worst interpretation, debt settlement, personal service, whatever Crow's men called it when they were getting your father to sign, those papers are not a legal instrument that allows one person to be transported against their will. Not in this county. Not in this state." He looked at her directly. "You're a person, Miss Boone, not a parcel." "Crow operates as if that distinction is negotiable," she said. "He operates that way in places where the law is either bought or frightened." Purcell's voice carried no heat, just the flat certainty of a man stating a working principle. "He's not in those places now." When she left his office, she stood for a moment on the boardwalk outside and let the morning sun fall on her face and breathed the air of the town, which smelled of dust and horses and wood smoke and the ordinary working life of ordinary people. And she felt something in her chest that was a complicated mixture of things, but had, underneath all of it, the solid, specific quality of ground that would hold weight. The 2 advance men were still at the boarding house. They hadn't moved on Cutter's place yet, which meant they were waiting for something, either orders or reinforcements, probably reinforcements. That was Crow's way, Alira thought. Don't move until the numbers said you could win. He wasn't a man who took chances on uncertain outcomes. She went back to the house and found Ronan in the yard with Cutter, talking to 2 of Cutter's drivers, men in their 30s and 40s who had the weathered, practical look of people who worked with their hands in all kinds of weather and conditions. They were listening to Ronan with the attention of men who are assessing whether the person talking to them knows what they're talking about, and their body language told her they'd concluded that he did. "How many men can Cutter get together who know how to handle a firearm?" she asked, coming up beside them. Ronan looked at her. Cutter answered, "In the next few hours, 8, maybe 10, not counting the drivers. Men I'd trust to hold their heads in a difficult situation." He glanced at Ronan. "More if we have until tomorrow." "Purcell's on our side," she said. "Solidly. He'll act if Crow's men make an unlawful move." She paused, working it through. "The problem is that Crow may bring enough men that even with Purcell's backing, the situation gets chaotic. And in chaos," she thought about the canyon valley, about shots in a confined space, about Ronan going sideways off his horse. "People get hurt." "What are you thinking?" Ronan asked. "I'm thinking Crow's strength has always been that people deal with him in isolation. One rancher, one debt, one arrangement at a time. Nobody sees the whole picture because they're all just dealing with their own piece of it." She looked at Cutter. "But if every person Crow's ever pressured in this county could see the same thing at the same time—" "You're talking about making it public," Cutter said. "I'm talking about making it impossible to contain. He can manage a debt dispute behind closed doors. He can't manage a public confrontation in front of an entire community that's already decided what it thinks." She looked at them both. "He's coming here because he thinks he can come to a strange town and take what he wants by the same methods that worked in Red Hollow. He doesn't know this town." Cutter was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a man in Harlan's Creek named Stowell. Used to range manage for an operation in the Southern Valley, gave it up when Crow bought the land and changed the terms. He knows people, ranchers, freighters, settlers from 3 counties. He met Alira's eyes. "If I explain the situation, he'll talk to people. And people out here don't like being told that someone's going to ride into their town and do as they please." "How long do we have?" Ronan asked. "If Garrett rode hard from the canyon," Alira calculated, "Crow could be moving by last night. He'd arrive by late afternoon at the earliest, more likely evening." "Then we use the morning," Cutter said, and there was a decisiveness in it that told her this was a man who, once he'd decided a thing was right, wasted no more time deciding. The morning moved fast. Cutter went to find Stowell. Della moved through her house with an efficiency that had something fierce underneath it, organizing, preparing, doing the specific work of a woman who has made a place her own over 15 years and has absolutely no intention of surrendering it. She found Elira in the front room at one point and stopped. "Your mother would have done exactly what you're doing," she said. Not in a gentle, consoling way. In a factual way, like she was reporting something she'd observed. Elira looked at her. Would she have been scared? Terrified, Della said. She was always terrified. She just never let it steer. She paused. Neither are you. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was true, and truth was what Elira needed. Ronan found her in the afternoon, sitting on the back steps of the kitchen garden with the pistol in her lap, checking the load for the third time that day, which was more about having something to do with her hands than about any actual concern regarding the load. He sat beside her. He moved carefully. The shoulder was better than yesterday, but still a considerable presence. And he sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the garden without speaking for a while. "There's something I should have said before," he said eventually. She waited. "When I walked into that street in Red Hollow," he stopped, started again. "I told you I did it because nobody else was going to. That's true, but it's not the whole truth." He looked at his hands. "I'd seen you that morning. In the general store, about an hour before it happened, you were buying something. Flour, I think. And you were arguing with the merchant about a short measure, and you were right about the short measure. And the merchant knew you were right and was trying to bluff through it, and you just..." He made a small gesture. "You stood there until he fixed it. No drama, just completely certain that right was right and waiting for the situation to catch up." She looked at him. "When I saw them walking you down that street, I thought..." He paused again. "I thought that was the same person, and what was happening to her was the exact opposite of what that person deserved, and I thought I could do something about it." He glanced at her sideways. "So I did." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a better answer than the first one," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." The thing that had been building between them in the miles and the dark, and the difficult stretches of honesty between people who've been through hard things together, it didn't resolve into anything simple or clean right then, sitting on the back steps with a pistol in her lap. It was just there, acknowledged, given its honest shape. That was enough for now. By mid-afternoon, Cutter had 16 men. They came in ones and twos through the back of the freight yard. Ranchers, drivers, a blacksmith, two brothers who ran a sawmill operation, old Stowell himself, who was 60 if he was a day, and carried a shotgun with the authority of long familiarity. They gathered in the freight warehouse, which was large enough and private enough, and Cutter explained the situation in the plain language of a man who didn't believe in unnecessary ornamentation. Elira stood at the edge of the group and watched their faces while he talked. She saw the thing happen that she'd hoped for and not entirely counted on. The particular shift that goes through a group of people when they recognize that the thing being described is not just one person's problem, but a shape they've all seen before, wearing different faces. Two of the ranchers exchanged a look that told her Crow had reached into their lives too, in one way or another. The blacksmith's jaw set with a slowness that suggested deep and private anger finding a legitimate direction. Purcell was there, standing at the back in his capacity as a law officer rather than a man with a rifle, and he observed the gathering with the careful attention of someone who was deciding in real time whether what he was looking at was a mob or a community, and concluding that it was the latter. Ronan spoke briefly. Not a speech, nothing like that. He told them what Crow's men were capable of from practical experience, what to expect in terms of numbers and tactics, how to position themselves so that Purcell's authority was supported rather than undermined. He was specific and calm and didn't pretend it was going to be clean. The men listened with the focus of people taking information seriously because the situation demanded it. When it was done and the gathering broke into smaller conversations, Old Stowell walked up to Elira and looked at her with eyes that had seen 50 or 60 years of this kind of country. "You started this," he said. Not accusatory, just acknowledging. "My father started it," she said. "I just declined to finish it the way Crow wanted." Stowell made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Well," he said, "we'll see how he likes the alternative." Crow's men arrived at the edge of town at 6 in the evening. Not Crow himself. Not yet, but 11 armed riders that Purcell's deputy spotted from the roof of the grain store where he'd been watching since 4 o'clock. 11 was more than they'd expected and fewer than they'd feared, which was the kind of mathematics that didn't simplify neatly into comfort. They came in on the main road, which told Elira something about Crow's expectations. He thought he was riding into a town that didn't know he was coming and wouldn't be organized enough to matter. He'd built his whole operation on the assumption that isolated people were easier to manage than connected ones. And he'd sent his men in on the front road because in Red Hollow, that would have been the correct tactical decision. Harlan's Creek was not Red Hollow. Purcell met them at the edge of town with his deputy and two of Cutter's men who had sufficient presence to make the point. The rest were positioned, not hidden exactly, but placed with the specific intention of being visible enough to count without escalating into a confrontation before Purcell had the chance to conduct himself as a lawman. Elira watched from the second-floor window of the freight office, which had a clear line of sight to the main street. Ronan stood beside her. Della was downstairs with a rifle she knew how to use, positioned at the front of the building where she'd been very clear about the fact that nobody was going to come through her family's property unchallenged. She watched Purcell walk out to meet 11 armed men on behalf of one person who'd shown up at Cutter's back door 2 nights ago, and she felt the weight of that. The full, improbable weight of what a community could be when it was actually that, rather than the collection of careful silences she'd grown up watching in Red Hollow. "He's not with them," Ronan said quietly. She looked. He was right. Crow wasn't among the 11 riders. She'd expected him, and he wasn't there, and she understood what that meant. "He's coming separately," she said. "He wants to see how this lands first." "Yes," Ronan said. "He'll want to know if 11 men were enough before he walks in personally." "They're not going to be enough." "No." A pause. "He's going to know that in about 10 minutes. Below on the street, Purcell was speaking with the man at the head of the riders. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the posture, the body language of an official conversation where one person is exercising legitimate authority and the other is calculating whether to respect it. The riders were aware of the men positioned around the street. She saw the calculation happening, saw the moment when the leading rider understood that this was not what he'd been told to expect. It took 20 minutes for the situation to fully resolve into something short of violence, which felt longer from a window and was probably the longest 20 minutes Purcell's deputy had ever spent on a rooftop with a rifle and sweating palms. The riders were told plainly that they had no legal standing in Harlan's Creek, that the woman they'd been sent to retrieve had entered the town freely and had the full protection of its law, and that their presence with this number of armed men constituted a threat that Purcell was prepared to address as such. They didn't leave. They fell back to the edge of town and stopped, which was its own kind of statement. They were waiting for Crow. He arrived at dusk. He came with 2 men, which was either confidence or theater, and he rode directly to Purcell rather than avoiding him, which told Elira that he'd processed the situation quickly and decided that confrontation through official channels was his next move. He was adapting. She'd known he would. She went downstairs. Ronan said her name once, in that quiet way that wasn't quite a warning and wasn't quite an objection, but was asking her to be sure of what she was doing. "I'm sure," she said. She walked out the front door of the freight office and onto the main street of Harlan's Creek in the long dusk light, and she walked toward the conversation that was happening at the far end of the street between Purcell and Silas Crow, and the watching men made way for her and nobody stopped her. Crow saw her coming. His face did something, a brief involuntary thing, quickly controlled, and then it settled back into the hard professional blankness he used for difficult situations. He was wearing a good dark suit. He'd ridden 40 miles in a good dark suit, which told you something about his relationship with appearances. She stopped 15 feet from him, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough to be outside the range of easy physical control. "Mr. Crow," she said. He looked at her the way he'd always looked at her in Red Hollow, with the particular assessment of a man who had decided what a thing was and expected the thing to agree. "Miss Boone, I think you understand this has gone far enough." "I understand that you rode 40 miles to tell me that," she said, "and I understand that you brought 11 men because you thought you'd need them, and those 11 men are standing at the edge of town because they found out this place isn't what you thought it was." Something moved in his face. Not anger exactly. It was more controlled than anger. "Your father has legal obligations. My father has debts," she said, "and those debts are between you and him. I am not a debt. I'm not a settlement. I'm not anything that was yours to arrange or claim, and whatever papers my father signed with your name on them, don't change that because there is no document in existence that makes a person property. Purcell was standing very still to her left. He was letting her speak, which she appreciated more than she could say in that moment. Crow looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the men positioned around the street. He looked at Purcell's careful, official stillness. He looked at the freight office, where Della Cutter stood in the doorway with the particular posture of a woman who has spent 15 years making something her own and has absolutely no intention of conceding it. "You've made enemies," he said to Elira. Quiet, just between them. "You made this an enemy situation," she said. "I just didn't behave the way you expected." He held her gaze for several seconds. She didn't look away. Then Purcell spoke, in the tone of a man who has waited long enough. "Mr. Crow, I need you to hear me clearly. There is no legal instrument that compels this woman to accompany you or your men anywhere. If your issue is a debt owed by Franklin Boone, that is a civil matter, and you are welcome to pursue it through the proper courts in the proper county. What you are not welcome to do is pursue it here, in my town, with 11 armed men." A pause. "I'll be writing to the county court in Red Hollow in the morning with a full account of your conduct in the matter of an armed pursuit across 2 counties. I'd encourage you to consider how that account reads before you make any further decisions tonight." The street held its breath. Silas Crow looked at Elira one more time, and what she saw in his face, beneath the control, beneath the calculation, was the thing he could not entirely hide and could not entirely afford to feel. The specific humiliation of a man who has never in his adult life been told no by someone he'd already counted as his, and who has arrived to enforce that claim and found the whole architecture of it standing on nothing but his own assumption that no one would organize against him. He turned his horse. He didn't speak again. He rode back toward his 11 men at the edge of town, and the 11 men read the situation with the professional accuracy of men who know when a situation has shifted beyond what they were paid to manage. And they turned too. Elira watched until the last of them were out of sight. The street let out its breath. Someone laughed, a short, sharp, genuine sound. Old Stoll said something she couldn't catch to the man beside him, and the man nodded. Purcell's deputy came off the roof of the grain store and looked faintly ill with relief, which was probably the most honest face on the street. She turned around and walked back toward the freight office. Ronan was standing at the edge of the building. He hadn't stayed inside. He'd come out at some point without her noticing, which meant he'd been there in her peripheral vision while she walked toward Crow, and she found that she was not surprised by this. She came up beside him, and they stood for a moment looking at the empty end of the street where Crow and his men had been. "His arm's going to be longer than this," Ronan said. "He's not done." "I know," she said, "but tonight he went home." She looked at the last gray light in the sky above the western ridge. "Tonight he rode out of this town without getting what he came for, and every person on this street saw it happen." She paused. "That's not nothing." "No," Ronan agreed. "It's not nothing." Della came out behind them and stood with her hand on the doorframe and looked at the street with the satisfaction of someone who had put a good deal of work into the creation of a certain kind of place and had just watched it demonstrate that it was what she'd worked to make it. "Come inside," she said. "Both of you. I've got food on the stove and we're all going to sit down like human beings and eat it." They went inside. The lamps were lit and the kitchen was warm, and the smell of food was one of the better things Elira had experienced in a week that had contained very few of them. She sat at the table, Cutter's table, Della's table, a table in a home that wasn't hers but had received her, and she thought about the word that Purcell had used on the street. This woman. Not this girl, not the Boone girl, not property. This woman. She'd need to remember that. She'd need to carry it forward into whatever the next part of this was, which was still uncertain and still had Crow in it somewhere on the other side, biding his time with the patience of a man who had money and reach and a particular wound to his pride that would take a long time to stop being a wound. But that was for tomorrow, and the day after, and however many days it took. Tonight she sat at the table and ate, and outside the window Harlan's Creek went about the end of its evening, and the street was quiet, and it was hers too, for now. In the way that places become yours when you've stood in them and held your ground and the ground held back. Crow did not go quietly. That was the thing about men like him. The public retreat was never the end of it. It was a tactical withdrawal, a regrouping, and anyone who'd watched him operate for longer than a season knew the difference between a man who'd given up and a man who'd gone home to think. Purcell knew it. He said so the morning after, sitting in Cutter's kitchen over coffee, his big hands wrapped around the cup with the deliberate patience of a man who has learned that the work doesn't end when the immediate crisis does. "He'll go legal," Purcell said. "That's my read on it. He doesn't have the social footing here to come back with force. Not after last night. Half the county saw his men back down. You can't recover from that with more guns. So he goes to a judge and he argues the debt instrument and he tries to make this a matter of civil law that he can win somewhere quieter." He looked at Elira. "Which means you need documentation of your own. What happened in Red Hollow. What his men did in the valley. Every piece of it, written down, witnessed, filed. Can he find a judge who'll rule in his favor?" Ronan asked. He was sitting with his back to the wall in the way he always sat. Old instinct, never fully off duty. And his shoulder was better than the day before. The careful quality of his stillness slightly less pronounced. "He can find a judge who owes him something," Purcell said. "He's been collecting those for 20 years. But a judge in this county is a different matter, and if the documentation is solid and the account of his conduct is filed before he can file his version, we have the advantage of the first story." He set down his cup. "The law moves slow. That works in our favor here. It means time, and time means people can organize." Elira had been listening with the part of her brain that processed practical information, and a different part had been running underneath it, quieter, working on something she hadn't said out loud yet. She said it now. "I need to go back to Red Hollow." The kitchen went still in the specific way rooms go still when someone has said a surprising thing that, the moment it's out, sounds more inevitable than surprising. Ronan looked at her. Purcell looked at her. Della, at the counter, didn't turn around, but her back changed in a way that said she was listening at full attention. "Not now," Elira said. "Not today." But Purcell's right. Documentation, witnesses, people who saw what happened on that street, who know what Crow's men have been doing in that valley for years. Those people are in Red Hollow. She paused. "And my father is in Red Hollow." Nobody said anything for a moment. "He's not going to fix what he did," she said, before anyone could try to address that. "I'm not going back to fix it either. But if Crow's going to make a legal argument using my father's name and my father's debt, then my father's account of what actually happened needs to exist somewhere in writing. What he signed, what he was told, it meant. Whether he understood what he was agreeing to." She looked at Purcell. "A man testifying that he was misled about what he signed changes the nature of the document. But boss..." Purcell considered this with the slow thoroughness she'd come to associate with him. "It does," he said. "Considerably." "Would he do it?" Ronan asked. He was asking about Franklin Boone, and his voice carried neither judgment nor false comfort, just the question. Elira thought about the kitchen table in the gray pre-light, the shaking hands, the face on the street. "I think he would," she said. "I think it might be the one thing he can actually do to make any of this right, and I think on some level he knows it." She wrote a letter to her father that afternoon. Della gave her paper and ink and left her alone in the small study off the front room, which smelled of old ledgers and the particular quiet of a space used for serious thinking. She sat at the desk and looked at the blank paper for a long time before she wrote anything. She didn't write about forgiveness. She wasn't going to offer something she didn't yet fully feel, because her father was a man who'd known her whole life, and he'd know the difference between what she meant and what she was saying in order to be gracious. She wrote what was true. She told him where she was and that she was safe. She told him what she needed, his written account, his willingness to speak to a lawman about what he'd signed and what he'd been told and what he'd understood the papers to mean. She told him that this was not about punishing him or protecting him, but about making an accurate record of a thing that had happened, because accurate records were the only tools the law had that were worth anything. At the end she wrote, "I don't know when I'll be ready to talk about the rest of it, but I am your daughter, and that is still true. That has to be enough for now." She sealed it and gave it to one of Cutter's drivers who was making a run south within the week, with instructions that it was to be delivered personally rather than left. The following days had the texture of a situation held in suspension, not resolved, not erupting, existing in the uncertain space between. Crow's name moved through conversations the way the names of difficult things do, referenced and considered and weighed. Purcell wrote his letters to the county court. Stowell talked to his network of ranchers and freighters and settlers, and the story spread in the way that true stories spread when they've got the right shape, not exaggerated, not dramatized, just passed from person to person with the specific detail that makes a thing feel real. People who'd had their own encounters with Crow's reach began to surface, cautiously, with accounts of their own. It turned out Alira had been right about isolation being his primary tool. Every person he dealt with had dealt with him alone, had sat across from his money and his organized patience and his legal instruments and felt that particular smallness of someone who has no one standing beside them. The moment those people could see each other, could recognize that they were not individually weak but had simply been individually separated, something shifted in the arithmetic of the situation. Ronan healed. His shoulder went from a thing he was managing to a thing he was working around to a thing that was mostly behind him, which happened over about 2 weeks and during which he made himself useful at Cutter's freight operation, in the ways a capable man makes himself useful when he's in a place that has work, and he's the kind of person who doesn't sit still comfortably. He and Alira talked. They'd been talking since Red Hollow, but it was different now. Not the talk of people moving through a crisis, exchanging necessary information, but the talk of two people who were in the same place for more than a night and had time to find out what the other person thought about things that weren't immediately life-threatening. She found out that he had opinions about horses that were specific and considered and sometimes surprising. He found out that she had been teaching herself to read Spanish from a book her mother had owned, with limited success but considerable stubbornness. She found out that he'd spent 2 years after his brother died doing work he wasn't proud of. Nothing that crossed what she privately thought of as the hard line, but things he'd done out of the kind of directionless anger that grief produces when it has nowhere legitimate to go. He told her this without excusing it, and without excessive self-flagellation, just as a fact about who he'd been, the way honest people talk about the less flattering chapters of their own histories. She told him things too, not everything at once, but steadily, the way trust builds when it builds correctly, not in a single gesture, but in accumulated small ones, each one a small extension of yourself toward another person, and seeing whether they handle it with care. 3 weeks after Crow had ridden out of Harlan's Creek, a letter arrived from Red Hollow. It wasn't from her father, it was from a woman named Dorothea Ames, the wife of the general store owner, someone Alira had known her whole life in the peripheral way you know everyone in a small town. She wrote to say that Franklin Boone had been to see Purcell's counterpart in Red Hollow, a deputy county sheriff named Walsh, who had more spine than Crow had given him credit for, and had given a written account of the circumstances surrounding the papers he'd signed. He'd been, she wrote, very clear and very specific, and Walsh had forwarded the account to the county court. She also wrote that Franklin Boone had left Red Hollow. He'd sold what remained of his cattle, settled what honest debts he had, and gone north to his sister's family in Wyoming, which was where he'd grown up before he'd come to Colorado as a young man. Dorothea Ames wrote this without editorial comment, which was itself a kind of editorial comment, just the fact of it offered plainly for Alira to make of what she would. She sat with that letter for a long time. He'd done it. He'd done the one concrete, useful thing, and then he'd left, which was, she thought, probably the right decision for both of them. Not forever, maybe, but for now. He needed distance from what he'd done, and she needed distance from the shape of the man he'd been when he'd done it. And the distance wasn't abandonment, it was just space. The room required to become something different from what you'd been. She wrote back to Dorothea Ames, thanking her for the information. She didn't write to her father, not yet. The legal situation with Crow moved with the grinding slowness that legal situations move with in remote counties in 1878, which is to say, it moved over months rather than weeks, and it moved through the accumulation of documented accounts and filed letters and the particular weight of a mining baron's conduct becoming a matter of public record rather than private leverage. Purcell was methodical and correct in his procedure, which was the right strategy. Crow could defeat passion, but he had a harder time defeating paperwork, especially when the paperwork was accurate and multiply witnessed and couldn't be bought because too many people had put their names to it. What eventually happened to Silas Crow was not dramatic. There was no single reckoning. There was instead a slow erosion. The kind that happens when a structure has been built on the assumption that nobody will look too closely at its foundations, and then someone looks. His mining operations faced labor disputes with newly organized workers who'd heard what had happened in Red Hollow and understood that isolation was the thing they needed to stop accepting. 3 of the ranchers whose debt he held renegotiated those debts through the county court under conditions that didn't favor him. The judge he'd been most relying on retired under the particular cloud that attaches to men who've been too visibly accommodating of powerful interests. He didn't go to prison. Alira had no illusions about that outcome being likely in a world where men like Crow knew how to stay on the near side of the line that the law actually enforced. But he became smaller. His reach contracted. The thing he'd built on fear and isolation began to develop holes that fear and isolation couldn't patch once people could see the holes. That mattered. It wasn't everything, but it mattered. She got a letter from him once, about 8 months after Harlan's Creek. It was brief, and it was written in the formal language of a man who was accustomed to communicating through legal instruments and had applied that register to a personal situation, which made it read oddly, but also made it, paradoxically, feel genuine, like he was reaching for precision because he couldn't find the right emotional vocabulary. He wrote that the debt had been restructured through the court to exclude any arrangement involving her specifically. He wrote that he considered the matter settled as far as he was concerned. He wrote, in the last line, that he hoped she was well. She read it twice and then set it aside. She didn't respond. What she was building in Harlan's Creek over those months was not simple or clean. It had the roughness that real things have. She worked for Cutter's freighting operation in the mornings, keeping accounts and managing the correspondence that James Cutter was very good at neglecting, and in the afternoon she worked on the things she'd been thinking about since she'd sat in Purcell's office and heard him say those 2 words, "this woman," as if they were perfectly ordinary, which was the kind of ordinary she intended to make her permanent standard. She was putting together a reading school, not an organized institution with a building and a seal, just a practical arrangement where children in the valley who weren't being reached by the existing school, which was underfunded and overcrowded and 12 miles from the outlying homesteads, could learn to read. She used Della's front room on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and she had 7 students by October and 11 by spring. And 2 of those 11 were adults who'd never been taught and who came in the evenings with the particular combination of determination and self-consciousness that adults bring to learning something they'd been told they should already know. She was not a perfect teacher. She had a tendency toward impatience when she thought a student was capable of more than they were attempting, and she had to consciously moderate that because impatience was useful for herself and counterproductive in a classroom. She made mistakes and corrected them and kept going, which was the only teaching method that actually worked. Ronan stayed. She didn't ask him to, and he didn't announce it. He just didn't leave. And after a while, the not leaving had settled into simply being present. And being present had settled into being part of the shape of the days. He was writing for Cutter by December, which gave him legitimate standing in the community as something other than the man who'd arrived with Elira, and he was good at it, good with the horses, good with the difficult clients, good with the kind of logistical problem that required someone to stay calm and think clearly when there was pressure to do neither. There was an evening in November when the first real cold of the season came off the mountains, and they were both sitting on the back steps of Cutter's house, which had become, in small ways, also their house, in the way that families absorb people who belong there, watching the last light go out of the sky. She'd been thinking about something she wanted to say, and she'd been working out how to say it for several days. "You could have left," she said, "after Red Hollow. After the valley, even. When Garrett got away, you'd done more than anyone had any right to expect. You could have left." He was quiet for a moment. "I know. Why didn't you?" He turned the question over in the way she knew now as genuinely thinking, not performance. "Because I didn't want to," he said. "Because I woke up the morning after Harlan's Creek, and I was in a place with people I respected and work that made sense, and a reason to be somewhere that had nothing to do with being in motion for its own sake." He paused. "And because you were here." She looked at him. The November sky was going the color of iron above the mountains. "That last part took you a while to get to," she said. "I'm working on saying hard things directly," he said. "It's a process." She took his hand, not dramatically, just reached across and took it, The way you do when you've decided something and don't feel the need to make a production of it. His hand was rough and warm, and he didn't pull away or make it into more than it was. They sat like that while the last light went out of the sky. The thing she'd learned in the months since her mother's dress had gotten dusty on a Red Hollow street was that the story people told about you was not the only story. There was the story Crow had told, which was that she was a thing to be acquired, a debt to be settled, a girl to be managed into the shape of what he'd decided he wanted. There was the story her father's mistake had written for her, debt and shame, and the particular smallness of being handed from one set of hands to another. Those stories had been written with intention by people who assumed she'd live inside them. She didn't live inside them. She'd walked out into the road, in a manner of speaking, and built something else. Not easily, not cleanly, with a lot of dust and fear and wrong turns, and at least one night lying in a ruined line camp listening to rain and genuinely not knowing how the next day was going to go, with help that had cost the people who gave it something and that she intended to spend the rest of her life remembering and honoring. With a man who'd stepped into the middle of her disaster because he thought someone ought to, and who'd turned out to be the kind of person who stayed. She thought about what Della had said. She was always terrified. She just never let it steer. That was the thing, Elira thought. That was the entire thing. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to give it the wheel. She'd been terrified from the moment her father sat at the kitchen table in the gray light to the moment she'd walked toward Crow on the main street of Harlan's Creek. And probably for a while after that too, if she was honest. Fear was there. It had always been there. It didn't mean the thing you were afraid of got to decide what you did. Spring came to Harlan's Creek with the urgency that high-altitude springs have. Fast, vivid, like the land was making up for lost time. The creek ran high, and the meadows went green almost overnight, and the mountains showed their snow clearly in the sharp new air. Her school had 13 students. She'd hired an assistant, a young woman named Lupe, who'd come up from the southern settlements and who was considerably better at patience than Elira and considerably better at Spanish, which was useful when dealing with the families who'd settled the western end of the valley. She and Ronan had taken on a small house that Cutter owned at the edge of the freight property, a practical arrangement that had grown naturally out of the preceding months and that Della had observed and quietly facilitated without making any pointed observations, which was her way of showing approval. The house was drafty and had a fireplace that needed work and a kitchen garden that had been let go and was going to take a season to put right. She was putting it right. She went out in the early mornings before the students arrived, while the air still had the cold edge of the night before, and she worked the soil and thought about her mother's garden and talked to the plants in a low murmur that she would never have admitted to in company, but which felt, in the privacy of the early morning, like something she was owed. Tomas Serrano came through Harlan's Creek in April, on his way north for reasons that had to do with his own family's affairs, and he came to find them because that was the kind of man he was. He sat at their kitchen table and drank the coffee Elira made, which was better than camp coffee and worse than Della's, which was an honest assessment, and talked with Ronan about the situation in the Southern Valley, the way men who've been through something together talk about it, with the shorthand of people who share a reference point. His boy, he said, the one who'd gone up the ridge with a glass. He'd decided he wanted to be a lawman, had written to the county seat about the process for becoming a deputy. He'll be good at it, Ronan said. He'll be careful at it, Tomas said, which is better. When Tomas left, Elira stood at the fence and watched him go and felt the particular thing you feel when you see someone who was part of a hard stretch of your life moving on through their own life. A gratitude that had no adequate expression, but that was real and specific and something she hoped he could somehow sense. Her father wrote in May. A real letter this time. Not the formal legal register of the previous one, but something closer to his actual voice, which she recognized even after everything because some people's voices travel intact through the written word and his always had. He was in Wyoming, working for his sister's husband's ranch operation. He was sober, he wrote, which she knew cost him something to put in a letter because he'd never been a man who admitted to needing to be. He asked nothing of her. He said he'd heard she'd built something in Harlan's Creek and that he was glad of it. She wrote back, not much, 2 short paragraphs that said she was well and that the school was growing and that she was glad he was working. She didn't say she'd forgiven him because that was still a thing in progress and she refused to lie about it. But she wrote back, which was itself a kind of answer about where they were. Some distances close gradually. Some never close all the way, and you learn to live with the shape of the gap rather than either pretending it isn't there or letting it define you. On the last Saturday of June, Elira and Ronan got married in the front room of Della and James Cutter's house, in a ceremony performed by the Justice of the Peace, a practical, unremarkable man who'd married half the county over 20 years and did it with a straightforward competence that suited them both. Purcell was there. Old Stowell was there. Tomas Serrano had sent a letter from Wyoming because he'd heard from someone who'd heard from someone, and the letter sat open on the windowsill and counted. Aldred the doctor stood at the back and looked satisfied, as if Ronan's surviving long enough to get married was a personal professional achievement. Della cried very briefly, and then looked slightly irritated at herself for having done it, which was such a precise expression of her character that Elira laughed, which meant she was also crying a little, which meant it was a room of people who were somewhat wrecked in the way people get wrecked at the good events, as well as the difficult ones. Ronan said his words with the directness that was simply how he said everything, and she said hers with the steadiness she'd been working on since a Wednesday kitchen table in April of the year before. And it wasn't perfect. She stumbled slightly on one sentence and had to restart it, which drew a quiet laugh from the small room. But it was real, and real was what she'd decided she was only interested in. Afterward, they ate at Della's table and talked, and the summer evening came through the windows slowly, and the mountains held the last light for a long time, the way they do in June, pink and gold and enormous. At one point, Ronan said something quietly to her that wasn't for the table, and she said something back, and whatever it was, it made him smile. A full, genuine smile that she still found slightly startling because it was so different from his ordinary expression and because she knew she was one of maybe 3 people in the world who'd seen it at full extension. She thought about the street in Red Hollow. She thought about a man stepping into the middle of it with a rifle and an entirely unclear plan and the simple conviction that someone ought to say something. She thought about how that single moment had ramified outward into all of this. The hard miles and the people who'd helped and the fear that had been there the whole time and not been allowed to steer. And now this room and this table and this man beside her. The thing about choices is that they compound. The small ones and the large ones both. You make one and it opens a direction and you walk in that direction and it opens others. And you're not always choosing consciously. Sometimes you're just in motion and the motion is already the choice. But each one carries weight forward into the next thing. And the shape of your life is what happens when enough of those choices have accumulated. She'd chosen to put her spine straight and walk down that street rather than collapse in the dust of it. She'd chosen to turn and look at Ronan Vale when he stepped into the road. She'd chosen to ride south out of Red Hollow rather than submit, and north through hard country toward a destination that turned out to be real. She'd chosen to walk toward Crow on the main street of Harlan's Creek when she could have stayed at the window. She'd chosen to write back to her father, just 2 paragraphs, which was its own small choice with its own weight. And Ronan had chosen, every day, to stay. Not dramatically, just steadily, in the way that the best kind of person shows up. Not with speeches, but with presence. Not with grand gestures, but with the repeated ordinary evidence of someone who means what they're there. People would eventually tell versions of this story, the town of Red Hollow, or people who'd passed through it, or people who'd heard from people who were there. The versions would drift, as versions do, and by the time they'd traveled enough miles and months, they'd have acquired elements that were more satisfying than true. The rifle in the road would become a standoff of mythological proportions. The ride north would acquire a storm that was larger than the actual storm. The confrontation on Harlan's Creek's main street would become a gunfight in most versions, which was simpler than the truth, and said something about what people preferred their stories to contain. The actual story was less symmetrical and more difficult, and considerably more human than any version that got passed around fires and saloon tables in the years that followed. It contained a father who loved his daughter and failed her in the largest possible way, and then did one concrete good thing and then got out of the way of his own damage. It contained a man with a particular capacity for stillness and direct sight who'd been moving for 7 years and found a reason to stop. It contained the sister of a dead woman who'd built something on her own terms in a strange valley and kept it. It contained a doctor who showed up, and an old man with a shotgun, and a boy on a ridge with a glass, and a lawman who used the words "this woman" like they were the most ordinary thing in the world. It contained a woman who was 18 years old and terrified and furious, and who never for a single moment let either of those things decide what she did next. That was the part that mattered, Elira thought, in the long run. Not the rifle or the canyon or the showdown on the street. Those were the events. The actual thing, the thing underneath all of them, was simpler and harder and less telegenic than any of those moments. It was the decision, made over and over in the small moments that don't make it into any version of the story, to be the person who chooses rather than the person who is chosen for. To take up the space that belongs to you, even when every structure around you is designed to make you feel like you don't deserve it. The evening went on. Harlan's Creek went on outside the windows, conducting its summer Saturday in the ordinary way of places that have their own life quite apart from any particular person's story. The mountains held their light and then let it go, and the first stars appeared in the darkening east, and the lamp on Della's table was lit, and the conversation ran in the comfortable directions that conversations run when people are warm and fed and have no immediate crisis demanding their attention. Elira looked at her husband. That was the new word, one she was trying out internally, feeling its weight and its implication. And he was listening to something Cutter was saying about the freight road, and his face had the quality she'd come to know as home, present, direct, genuinely paying attention to the actual thing in front of him. She'd have time to know all of it, she thought. The parts she already knew and the parts she didn't yet. That was what staying in a place meant. Time. Not the compressed, precious time of the road where everything was vivid because everything mattered immediately, but the long, ordinary time of a life being built, which had its own kind of richness if you paid attention to it correctly and didn't make the mistake of only valuing the dramatic portions. She intended to pay attention to it correctly. She intended to make it worth the ride. Outside, the mountains went dark against a sky full of stars, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the way the wilderness is beautiful when you're far enough from being in danger of it to simply see it clearly. The creek ran somewhere in the dark below the town. The horses moved in the corral. And inside the lamp-lit room, in the middle of a life she'd built from what she'd carried and the people who'd chosen to stand beside her, Elira Vale sat at a table that had become hers and felt not finished, never finished. There was always more ahead, but arrived. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.